Random Story of Our Canadjun Ancestors by Darcy John Bouchard. Copyright 2023, 2008. Oghjagere, The Great Falls of Niagara. Condensed and abridged from An Old Frontier of France, the Niagara region and adjacent lakes under French control, Volume 1, by Frank Hayward Severance, including other references. Fur traders, Jesuit priests, and ordinary adventurers yearned to leave Europe and its stifling social, economic, and religious constraints behind, and look toward the new lands across the Atlantic to which England and France were then staking claim. The exploits of the men who had first claimed these lands were legendary. Jesuit religious missions in the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay drainage systems. 3 religious communities participated in the evangelism of the natives of Canada, the Jesuits. 1. The Recollets and the Sulpicians. They wore simple, unadorned black robes which covered them from collar to toes and came to be known to the natives as black robes. The Jesuits, also known as Soldiers of Christ, were not only religious activists but an army which operated with military precision, governed by a list of rules created for the Jesuit order by founder St. Ignatius Loyola in 1540. The Holy Bible, instead of being a guide, became a tool which could be used by the Jesuits to meet their desired ends. The Jesuits were ruled by the will of the Church rather than the will of God, and their rules placed the Church above God, thereby granting them the authority to use whatever means was necessary to accomplish their tasks. This also placed them above the state, effectively removing free will from the people and placing it in the hands of the Church. The Jesuits believed that their God predestined them for heaven and nothing could alter that destiny. However, the Aboriginal peoples were savages destined to eternal damnation and, therefore, deserving of subjugation by the Roman Catholic Church. In 1615, the Recollets arrived in Canada, 5 years after the Jesuits. They had come from France on one of Samuel de Champlain's many voyages, journeyed into Huronia and began the conversion of the Hurons to Christianity. The Jesuits Paul Léjeune, Charles Lalemant, and Jean de Brebeuf arrived in 1625. While Léjeune and Lalemant began their work with the natives around Quebec, Brebeuf headed west into Huronia to begin his missionary work there. He built several Jesuit missions near Georgian Bay. Brebeuf was accompanied by his personal servant, 15-year-old Pierre Boudin. During this period, the men of the Ottawa tribe acted as the principal middlemen in the fur trade, and took vast numbers of furs to Montreal every year where they exchanged them with Europeans for goods such as guns, cloth, and knives. By the 1660s, masses of young French Canadian men from every class of society were moving inland to trade with Aboriginals in their own villages, rather than paying the high prices demanded by the Ottawa middlemen. These men had licenses to trade from the government of Nouvelle-France, but many went into the Pays d'en Haut, or upper country, west of Montreal, to trade illegally. These outlaws were referred to as coureurs de bois, or wood runners. The Hurons resisted adapting to the heathen French culture and very few natives were converted. More and more, the natives were trading their furs for fire-water, and the Jesuits began to petition the king for legislation which would either ban or limit the trade of alcohol with the natives. Their efforts were finally rewarded with a decree on February 23, 1662 prohibiting the sale of alcohol for furs under threat of excommunication. 2. Along with their religion, the Jesuits also brought disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the Huron villages like a firestorm. Every day, hundreds of Hurons died. Huron shamans blamed the Jesuits for poisoning them and rejected the Catholic faith. They also resented being asked to break their own laws of nature by hunting and trapping out of season. As animosities rose, the Huron population declined. By 1649, the Huron had been decimated and the Iroquois, mortal and lifelong enemies to the Hurons which easily swept through Huronia, from a 30,000 strong nation, only a few hundred Hurons remained, dispersed throughout the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. Jesuit missionaries were captured, tortured, and executed. The promontory at the outlet of the Niagara River into Lake Ontario was a strategic point for controlling the route to the interior Great Lakes region. The French early recognized its importance. La Salle, in 1678, and Denonville, in 1687, erected temporary fortifications. Niagara River and Lake Erie. The Huron people were devastated by epidemics throughout the 1630s and 1640s, as well as successive raids by the Iroquois Five Nations after 1649. Along with the Seneca, the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, League included the Oneida, Mohawk, Onondaga, and Cayuga. Later, the Tuscarora or shirt-wearing people became the sixth nation to join the Confederacy, fleeing from British-occupied North Carolina. Given guns by Dutch colonists, the Seneca were great conquerors and highly skilled at warfare. They were fierce adversaries to any other tribe who tried to resist their takeover, by conquest and absorption of the Neutrals, in 1651, and the Erie, in 1656. The Seneca acquired possession of the country westward to Niagara River and Lake Erie and correspondingly increased their own strength. In 1656 one of their four towns was made up entirely of captives. One of the distinctive features of the Iroquois warriors' appearance was their hair, which they kept shaved, and their heavily tattooed bodies. Iroquois warriors were also believed to have participated in ritual cannibalism and were also known to torture their prisoners. Iroquois politics were the most sophisticated in all of the native cultures. The Seneca, with the exception of one tribe, the Tonawanda, having adopted a democratic form of government after years of questionable leadership by chiefs who had come into their positions out of lineage rather than virtue. The Seneca women were in charge of elections, and decided who was to become tribal leader. Leaders usually held their posts for life, but could be removed if they became corrupt or proved to be incompetent. The Seneca political system also included a constitution, which is believed to have been the model for the American Constitution. Domaine du Roi in 1653, Méthode Chouart, Sieur des Groseilliers, was sent out by the French crown to encourage Western native nations to bring their furs directly to Montreal. His success shows that French agents in the interior can guarantee the supply of beaver pelts. This would later lead French authorities to send explorers such as Charles Albanel, Père Jacques Marquette, and Sulpician missionaries François Dollier de Casson, and René de Brehant de Galigny to find trade routes and develop religious missions in the Great Lakes and Hudson Bay drainage systems. The Domaine du Roi was established. 3. In what is now the central portion of the province of Quebec, an area leased to an individual or company who enjoyed exclusive fur trading rights within it for a defined period of time. With the expansion of French fur trade, the Ottawa and Montagne fur traders were increasingly replaced by French Canadian coureurs des bois, who exchanged European goods and transported pelts back to Montreal. In 1659, Pierre Radisson and Méthode Chouart, Sieur des Groseilliers, made an unlicensed trip into the interior and built a trading post at Chequamegon Bay on Lake Superior and claimed to have found a portage into the west. They spent the winter among Huron, Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Dakota Indians in the region south of Lake Superior. In 1663, Nouvelle-France became a territory governed like all French provinces, with its own intendant and crown representative. Under Jean Talon, efforts were made to increase settlement and strengthen the economy, and the various fur trade companies holding monopolies disappeared as a new regime of colonization was instituted. François Dollier de Casson and René de Brehant de Galigny. François Dollier de Casson, considered a second founder of Montreal, was the son of a family of minor nobility in France, was born at Château de Casson-sur-Elardre in Brittany, near Nantes, in 1636, and he died at Montreal on 27 September 1701. He became a soldier and, before the age of 20, was a cavalry captain under Turenne, his bravery eliciting this general's esteem. In 1657, he entered the seminary of St. Sulpice at Paris after 3 years of military service and was sent to Canada to engage in missionary work in 1666. There he devoted himself with great ardor as military chaplain and, later, in 1666, he accompanied the Preville-Tracy expedition against the Mohawks, and spent the winter of 1666 to 1667 at Fort Ste. on Lake Champlain. François Dollier de Casson became pastor at Trois-Rivières between 1667 and 1668 and spent the winter from 1668 to 1669 on a mission to the Nipissing to learn the Algonquian language, where he was told of large numbers of natives living around Lake Superior and determined to find these people. In Montreal, Dollier met René Brehant de Galigny, whom joined him in his quest to find the Lake Superior natives. René de Brehant de Galigny, Sulpician prior of Saint-Maur de Nazar, Saint-Brook, was born about 1645 in the Diocese of Rennes, France, and he died in 1678 in Europe. The Brehant family descended in direct line from the ancient chivalric nobility whose motto was, Foi de Brehant bot mieux argent, the pledged word of a Brehant is better than silver. Brehant had followed St. Louis on his crusades and was descended from a crusader who bore the name of Galilee, which later became Galigny. Under François I, the Seigneur Mathurin de Brehant married the only daughter of the Seigneur de Galigny, and from this stock was born René de Brehant de Galigny, who came to New France in 1668. The relative peace in the late 1660s stimulated the colonial authorities' wish to promote the discovery of a passage to China. The missionaries, motivated by the testimony of the many aboriginal nations living on the edge of the Mississippi, wished to bring the Christian faith in this region. On July 6, 1669, M. de Thubières de Lévis-Declas, superior of the Sulpician Seminary at Montreal, sent missionaries François Dollier de Casson and Michel Barthélemy with the mad explorer Robert Cavalier de La Salle. 4. As part of an original party of 22 Europeans and Algonquian interpreters to try to reach the Mississippi, in order to pave the way for Sulpician missions among the western tribes. Being suspicious of the famous explorer's loyalty, Declas replaced Barthélemy by René de Brehant de Galigny, whose knowledge of mathematics and astronomy might be valuable in case of desertion. Dollier and Galigny, accompanied by 7 men in 3 canoes, followed the south shore of Lake Ontario, then crossed the Niagara River but pressed for time, chose not to pursue the rumor of waterfalls and continued on to Tinewatawa, near Hamilton. Here, on September 24, they met Adrien Joliet, brother of Louis Joliet, discoverer of the Mississippi, and Jean Père, returning from a trip to the Great Lakes, where the intendant Jean Talon had sent them to visit a copper mine. These inform the missionary explorers of a road to follow to achieve their goal. And, in late October 1669, La Salle, who had fallen ill, separated from the missionaries at the tip of Lake Ontario, so, leaving La Salle and his men there and joining Joliet's team, Dollier and Galigny continued their journey to the north shore of Lake Erie, and set up a winter camp, in what is now Norfolk County, Ontario, having chosen the site for its aesthetic appeal and abundant food sources. Dollier and Galigny declared the area a territory of France in the name of King Louis XIV. On March 23, 1670, 3 days prior to the group's departure, a large cross was erected with the arms France. The two continued on through Lake Erie to the Detroit River and north to Lake St. Clair. Somewhere near the mouth of the River Rouge, the priests found a rock formation carved into sculpture by Native Americans. Believing it to be an idol and thus a sacrilege, the priests used their hatchets to destroy it. In March of 1670, Dollier and Galigny proceeded by St. Clair River to Lake Huron, where they finally took refuge in the Jesuit mission at Sault Ste. Marie. They thence returned to Montreal via the Ottawa River. In the autumn of 1671, François Dollier de Casson succeeded Declas and was named 4th Superior of the Sulpicians and Seigneur of Montreal, and, later he was Vicar General of the Diocese of Quebec. 5. He competently fulfilled his religious duties and tried to improve education in Ville-Marie, Montreal. After 1680, Dollier helped with the Lachine Canal project, and established a conciliatory climate for relations between the colony's civil and religious authorities and, moreover, stimulated the energy of the colonists under trying and hazardous circumstances. In the autumn of 1671, Dollier de Casson became superior of the Seminary of Montreal, and he died on September 25, 1701 there at Montreal. Lack of French interest in Hudson Bay coupled with the vigorous ambition of a group of English aristocrats and merchants inspired by the travels of Radisson and de Groseilliers, induced England's Charles II to grant them the privilege of exploiting the furs of Hudson Bay, in 1670. As a result, the Hudson Bay Company, HBC, was chartered. The French disputed the British claim and tried to prevent the company from establishing trading posts on the coast of the bay. In 1673, after leading the building of Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, La Salle took command. He then left Canada for France to obtain letters patent to install the new settlers' lordship of Frontenac. Armed with permission to colonize and build forts, he began to find the mouth of the Mississippi in 1678. Père Jacques Marquette. Père Jacques Marquette, 6. French Jesuit missionary, was deployed by his superiors to missions farther up the St. Lawrence River in the western Great Lakes region. Marquette helped found a mission at Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan in present-day Michigan, and at La Pointe, on Lake Superior near the present-day city of Ashland, Wisconsin. Here he encountered members of the Illinois tribes, who told him about the important route of the Mississippi River. He was invited to teach their people, whose settlements were mostly further south but, because of wars between the Hurons at La Pointe and the neighboring Lakota people, Marquette left the mission and went to the Straits of Mackinac. He informed his superiors about the rumored river and requested permission to explore it. On May 17, 1673, Jacques Marquette and French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet, 7. departed from St. Ignace with 2 canoes and 5 Métis voyageurs. They followed Lake Michigan to Green Bay and went up the Fox River, nearly to its headwaters. From there, they portaged a distance of slightly less than 2 miles through marsh and oak plains to the Wisconsin River. At that point the French later built the trading town of Portage, named for its location. They ventured forth from the portage and, on June 17, entered the Mississippi near present-day Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. The rivers they used later became the major transportation route to the western trading regions. The Joliet-Marquette expedition traveled to within 435 miles, 700 kilometers, of the Gulf of Mexico, turning back at the mouth of the Arkansas River, at what point they encountered natives carrying European trinkets, precipitating an encounter with explorers or colonists from Spain. They followed the Mississippi back to the mouth of the Illinois River, where they learned from local natives of a shorter route back to the Great Lakes. They reached Lake Michigan near the site of modern-day Chicago by way of the Chicago Portage. In September, Marquette stopped at the mission of St. Francis Xavier, located in present-day Green Bay, Wisconsin, whilst Joliet returned to Quebec. Marquette and his party returned to Illinois Territory in late 1674, becoming the first Europeans to winter in what would become the city of Chicago. As welcomed guests of the Illinois Confederation, the explorers were feasted en route and fed ceremonial foods such as sagamite. 8. In the spring of 1675, Marquette traveled westward and celebrated a public mass at the Grand Village of the Illinois near Starved Rock. A bout of dysentery which he had contracted during the Mississippi expedition sapped his health and, on the return trip to St. Ignace, he died, age 38, and, on May 18, 1675, was buried by 2 French companions somewhere along the Lake Michigan shore, near the modern town of Ludington, Michigan. Louis Hennepin, Franciscan Recollect friar and explorer, came to Canada in 1675, meeting La Salle, who made him chaplain of his proposed western expedition in 1678. Duluth returned to Mackinac by the Wisconsin and Fox rivers and, at Mackinac, he heard that jealous Quebec merchants had slandered him and were accused him of being a coureurs de bois, an unlicensed trader, trading with the English, and encouraging trappers to defy the royal decree of April 15, 1676, which forbade the inhabitants of New France to the fur trade directly with the Indians or outside existing settlements, to protect the monopoly of the merchants. It also put an end to the widespread practice of trading permissions granted by local authorities. On the first offense, it took the goods and imposed a fine of £2,000. In the second, the penalty was considered by the intendant of New France Jacques Duchesneau de la Dussinière et d'Ambald. Forced to return to Montreal, Duluth thence went to Paris in 1681, to defend himself against false accusations of treason, in order to exculpate himself and at the same time convince authorities about the relevance of a fort built on Lake Superior. Duluth returned the following year, to put an end to the disorder in the French fur trade. The Compagnie des Indes Occidentales, the colonial authorities, and the most powerful merchants had joined forces and were proposing important changes. After this date, the company would only deal with established traders, whilst the government would issue special permits to trade in the West. All canoes were to be registered and the colony's troops were to police the trade. The coureurs de bois became outlawed. In 1678, Daniel Greysolon, Sieur d'Ulhut, 9. Son of Claude Greysolon and Marie de Patronat, his name has been anglicized as Duluth, a French soldier and explorer renowned as the king of the coureurs de bois, came to the Great Lakes with his younger brother La Tourette to explore the rich fur-bearing regions north and west of Lake Superior and to pacify the indigenous people and in the hope of discovering a route to the Western Ocean. Wintering near Sault Ste. Marie and reaching the western end of the lake in the fall of the following year, a master in the art of Indian domination, he concluded a treaty of peace on September 15, 1659, ending a Ojibwe/Chippewasu war, ensuring that their furs would flow to the French at Lake Superior rather than to the English at Hudson Bay. And, in 1679, he made an alliance with the Siouan Confederacy which gave France possession of their territory and made the region safer for traders. He also explored Lake Superior and the high inland plateau where the Mississippi, the Red River, and the St. Lawrence rise, erected the fortified post of Kaministiquia, now Fort William, and to that point he attracted tribes who lived hundreds of miles away in the forests and on the prairies, and afterwards built Fort La Tourette on Lake Nepegan. After some time spent at Fort Frontenac, Hennepin sailed, 1679, in the Griffin, the first ship on the Great Lakes, for Green Bay. La Salle reached the mouth of the Illinois River and crossed to the Mississippi and from there sent Hennepin and Michel Aco, called 10. La Salle's lieutenant, and Antoine Augal. Michel Aco, called, was favored by La Salle because of his courage, prudence, and wide acquaintance with Native American languages, on an expedition which was the first to explore the upper Mississippi Valley. They ascended the river to Minnesota, where they were captured by the Sioux. In the course of his captivity Hennepin first saw and named the Falls of St. Anthony, where Minneapolis was located. Afterward he was the first to describe such parts of America as the Upper Mississippi and Niagara Falls. French authorities estimated that close to 500 men were trading in the West. Fierce competition had developed among trappers and merchants, and many had great difficulty recovering debts from coureurs de bois. Duluth, deceived by native stories of a western sea of vermilion, the Indians having argued that undrinkable salt water was only 20 days' walk away, likely the Great Salt Lake in Utah, with 5 companions ascended the Brule River, portage to Upper St. Croix Lake, and descended the St. Croix River to the Mississippi, presumably the first white man to utilize this route. In June of 1680 Duluth rescued the Recollect priest Louis Hennepin, whom had been stranded in the wilderness amongst the Sioux in a village of about 1,000 inhabitants, and, thence, they headed back to Michilimackinac. The season being advanced, though, they decide to winter at Michilimackinac before returning to the settlements on the St. Lawrence. François de la Forest, was born in Paris in 1648, and he died on October 16, 1714 in Quebec. In 1679 and 1680, he accompanied La Salle to Fort Frontenac and present-day Illinois, respectively. In 1682, while La Forest was commandant of Fort Frontenac, he was instrumental in helping Frontenac, then governor of New France, establish a peace treaty with the Iroquois. When Frontenac was removed from office as governor of New France, La Forest filed a complaint that eventually won Frontenac reinstatement. In the summer of 1685, La Forest was made commandant of Fort St. Louis, and he maintained that post until 1687. In 1682, La Salle went down the river from Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico and named the country Louisiana. He returned to France and in 1684 became head of a naval expedition to form the colony of Louisiana. The settlers were unable to find the mouth of the Mississippi River, revolted and killed him. Jacques-René de Brécy de Denonville, Marquis de Denonville, 11. had arrived at Quebec on August 1, 1685 at a dangerous point in the colony's conflict with the Iroquois and English, Pierre de Troyes, 12. also arrived at Quebec in August 1685 amongst the reinforcements for the beleaguered colony. Taking the initiative, Denonville sent de Troyes overland to attack English posts on James Bay, 1686, thereby removing the threat on the colony's northern flank. Departing on March 20, 1686, de Troyes led a force of 30 colonial regular French troops and 60 of the militia from Montreal overland to James Bay. Using the skills of the voyageurs, the expedition ascended the Ottawa River, portaged via Lake Temiskaming and Lake Abitibi to the Abitibi River and descended on the English at Moose Fort, which succumbed on June 20. De Troyes next occupied Rupert House, Fort Charles, on July 3 and, with the captured English ship Craven, took Fort Albany on July 26, before leaving Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, 13. in charge and sailing back to Quebec. In 1683, Duluth was off on a new expedition, wheretofore he established his brother in trade on Lake Nipigon and built at Fort Kaministigoyen at the mouth of the Kaministiquia River, the site of the present city of Thunder Bay, Ontario. But, he was recalled to join Peru in leading an expedition against the Iroquois. On account of his intrepidity, Duluth had great influence over the savages, who admired and feared him. He kept them loyal to France and obliged them to join the expeditions which La Barre and Denonville organized against the Iroquois in 1684 and 1687. Returning to Kaministiquia, he prepared to search for the Western Sea, but was again recalled to fight the Iroquois. In 1685, after having signed a peace treaty with Miami and Illinois Indians to resist the expansion of the English-backed Iroquois, Robert Cavalier de La Salle landed on the coast of Texas, opening the way for French trade in the lower Mississippi and the establishment of colonies in that region. In 1686, Duluth built Fort St. Joseph on the St. Clair River between Lake Erie and Lake Huron, and laid the foundation of the post of Detroit. He spent the remainder of his life exploring and conducting a profitable Indian trade and was especially valuable in helping to protect the Wisconsin area against raids of the Iroquois and, in general, retaining the loyalty of France's Indian allies. In so doing, he promoted French ascendancy throughout the Northwest. He went on his last Lake Superior expedition in 1688. The Seneca, keepers of the Western Door. By the summer of 1687, the Iroquois had been actively raiding their Indian neighbors to the north and west of the Genesee Valley region for almost 4 decades. Genesee meant Beautiful Valley to the Seneca, keepers of the Western Door of the Iroquois Nation, an area they had occupied since the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy about 1550. The westernmost and largest of the 5 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Seneca's original territory lay between Seneca Lake and the Genesee River, they were nearly equal in population to all the other 4 tribes together and dominated northward into Canada and southward into Pennsylvania, but the Seneca were only represented by 8 of the 50 chiefs. The name Seneca is a corrupted form of an Algonquian term originally applied to the Oneida, signifying, people of, the place of the stone. They called themselves Gionondaonen Ranan, people of the Great Mountain, approximated by the French as Tsenantwin, from their principal village of that name, probably near the present Naples in Ontario County. Sedentary villages were well fortified with wooden stake fences. They relied heavily on agriculture, growing corn, squash, and beans, which they referred to as Diohako, the life supporters. In addition to raising crops, the Seneca would hunt in the fall and fish in the spring. What remained of the fragmented Huron tribes were taken as captives in Iroquois raids designed to capture furs and replacements for their own dead. These raids were quick strikes aimed at capturing the Western Indians' processed furs as well as captives that would either be ceremonially executed as part of a ritualized mourning process, tortured, burned, and eaten, or to be assimilated into the Iroquois war party's village as a replacement for recently lost friends and loved ones. These characteristically brutal Iroquois raids, spanning nearly 2/3 of the 17th century, have been cumulatively referred to as the Beaver Wars, an Iroquois attempt to monopolize the lucrative fur trade with the Dutch, and later the English, at Albany, New York. Upon the Jesuits' arrival into Iroquois territory, the Huron captives and refugees then living among the Seneca tribe welcomed the priests. In the decades leading up to Denonville's raid into Seneca territory in the summer of 1687, Jesuit priests, the Black Robes, were hard at work attempting to convert the savage Iroquois. Jesuit presence was initially tolerated by the Seneca sachems as a result of diplomatic agreements made between Onondaga and Nouvelle-France in 1653, but by the time of Denonville's raid, the Jesuits were being forcefully expelled. In a native society where people had nothing to hide from one another and where almost all activities were conducted in the open, the Jesuit insistence of periodic privacy and refusal to accept visitors unless at specified times surrounded the priest with an aura of questionability, especially if misfortunes in war befall his hosts or should epidemics or famine accompany him as he passed from tribe to tribe or village to village. Nouvelle-France was faced with a mounting Iroquois threat which was nearly impossible to contain. In 1687, Denonville, seconded by Chevalier Louis Hector de Calliers, 14. and Rigaud de Vaudreuil, raided deep into Seneca territory in the summer 1687 having one thing on his mind, to punish the Iroquois. Landing at Irondequoit Bay, Denonville marched south at the head of a large army bent on destroying the main Seneca villages at Ganondagan and Rochester Landing as retribution for the lost flow of beaver pelts that the Iroquois raiding parties had redirected from Montreal to Albany. Denonville's invasion of Seneca territory was the western arm of the French offensive aimed at removing the Iroquois nuisance. Of the Iroquois Five Nations, only the Cayuga were left untouched by French aggression from 1680 to 1700. For the Seneca, however, Denonville's invasion was devastating. The main Seneca villages were abandoned and burned before Denonville's army arrived, and their former inhabitants made their way to Cayuga territory as refugees. The Seneca would spend the next year living with their Iroquois brethren before moving back to their own territory in the spring of 1688. There little rest for Calliers after his return to Canada late in 1689. Iroquois war parties prowled in the district of Montreal and constantly threatened the lives and properties of the population. Montreal had been enclosed with a strong palisade, and redoubts made of staves 14 feet high had been built on each seigneurie to provide the inhabitants with protection against Iroquois forays. Knowing Montreal was in good hands, Buet de Frontenac intervened little in the affairs of the upper colony and spent most of his time in Quebec. Louis Thomas Chabert de Joncaire. The name Louis Thomas Chabert de Joncaire, 15. Esquire, son of Antoine Marie de Joncaire de Chabert, Esquire, 16 and Gabrielle Hardy 17, found among the nobility, has been around a history of Detroit since its British beginnings, a very humble character compared to several of his titled superiors, courageous and arrogant, ruthless and unscrupulous, hated and feared by the English, admired by the Iroquois who consider him one of them. Joncaire was for more than 40 years, a unique ambassador of French influence amongst the Aboriginal peoples. It was through his skillful diplomacy, made efficient by his peculiar relations to the natives, that France was able to gain a foothold on the Niagara, for trade and for defense, and to maintain it for more than a quarter of a century. Louis Thomas Joubert de Joncaire had been born about 1670 in the little town of Stremy, France. He, age 17, had come to Nouvelle-France in either 1687 or 1689 as a cavalry sergeant of the guard of the governor, but, when sent on a mission to improve relations with the Iroquois, he and several of his comrades were captured and kidnapped by a band of Canadjuns, Seneca, during one of the violent skirmishes along Denonville's route. Traveling with the Seneca on their short trek through Cayuga territory, he and his fellow captives were taken east, where all but Joncaire were tortured to the point of death by their native captors. Joncaire was spared further torture and imminent death when he fiercely fought off a Seneca war chief who was attempting to bind his hands, before pulling his fingernails out as a preliminary torment as they were fastening him to a stake. To burn him, he gave a blow of his fist on the nose of the one who held him, which made the savage's nose bleed. The Seneca witnesses respected Joncaire's warrior spirit, admiring a man who dared, alone, defend his life among his enemies, whom refused to give in to fate by crying or screaming as many of the other French captives had. As a result of his proven courage, a widow woman of the Seneca adopted Joncaire in the tradition of mourning war. He thus became a Canadjun and was given the name Senenkes and placed within his new Seneca family. Many a captive French soldier had been brought trembling and fainting into the fierce Seneca's lodges only to be adopted as one of the nation by a young squaw. The rigors and discomforts of the frontier post and wilderness campaign prepared him to accept the filth and rudeness of savage life. In matters of cruelty and barbarity, the French soldiers were too often the equal to the Indian. The freedom of the forest life appealed to the Gallic blood. There was adventure, license, and abundance amongst his savage captors. There were many who preferred to abide in the Indian villages, pleasantly seated in the beautiful valleys of central New York, rather than return to the duties and privations of service in Nouvelle-France. 18. From that moment, the Indians placed their trust and friendship in Joncaire and, having a unique aptitude for languages, he soon mastered the Native American dialects and mentality and became royal interpreter for the Five Nations, becoming a valuable tool for Nouvelle-France to conduct negotiations with this great tribe. Having achieved the rank of sachem in the short span of 7 years among the Seneca, Joncaire was eventually released in 1694 along with 14 other captives, and preserved their esteem to the day of his death. As a result of French legislation, the coureurs de bois were gradually replaced by trade permit-holding employees called engagés or voyageurs, wage laborers who contracted with a merchant to transport goods and furs to and from posts in the West. In 1691, Henry Kelsey was the first to travel far inland from the posts of the HBC. His trek led him as far as northern Saskatchewan. Antoine de Lamoth Cadillac. Antoine Lamotte de Lamoth Cadillac. 19. Known for his prowess with the sword, was commandant of Fort de Buade. He was also said to have a very prominent nose, earning him the nickname Le Faucon, Hawk. Interested in profits by personally controlling trade, he was troubled by the idea of not having a major stronghold in the west to keep the British on the east coast. He wanted to Europeanize the natives and entice them to establish settlements around the post. He believed that the area now known as Le Detroit was the perfect place to carry out his plans. The river would help in defending the fort, as well as making travel easy. Cadillac probably first set foot on North American shores when he landed in Acadia, in 1683, as an obscure member of the French military forces sent to the French garrison in Port Royal, now Annapolis Royal, Nova Scotia. He met French Canadian privateer François Guyon at the governor's ball at Quebec's Chateau St. Louis, and Guyon recruited the young Cadillac to sail with him on his numerous forays down the New England coast. Guyon took a shine to Cadillac and showed him the ways of the sea and taught him the art of navigation. Lamotte earned a reputation of being an expert navigator. Signing the marriage register as Lamotte Launay and naming his parents as Jean de Lamotte, Sieur de Cadillac, de Launay et de Simontel and Jean de Malenfant, Antoine Lamotte de Cadillac, aged 29, married the privateer's niece, Marie-Therese Guyon. 20. Age 16 or 17, daughter of Denis Guyon, son of Jean-Jacques Guyon and Mathurin Robin, and Elizabeth Boucher, daughter of François Boucher and Florence Guerman. On June 25, 1687, 14 children are known to have been born of this union between 1692 and 1710. 21. The couple lived in Port Royal, Acadia, now Nova Scotia, for a short time. In 1688, through the offices of the Guyon family, Cadillac was able to secure a seigneurie, a grant of land, in an area known as Donaxie, near Port Machias, which included part of the Donaxie River, Union River, Maine, and the island of Mount Desert, off the coast of present-day Maine. Governor de Nonville granted the request on July 23, 1688, and Louis XIV confirmed the transaction on May 24, 1689, and he and Marie-Therese relocated back to the Acadian wilderness, developing trading connections at Port Royal and traveled frequently back to France to give official reports at court. He won the confidence of Louis de Pontchartrain, Ministry of Marine. In 1689, Cadillac was sent to Paris to help the court plan a sea attack against the British in New England. At this time, Cadillac started referring to him as Antoine de Lamotte, Sieur de Cadillac, Donaxie et Mount Desert, or Antoine de Lamotte Cadillac, Sieur de Donaxie et Mount Desert. While Cadillac was still away, in 1690, Port Royal was the site of French and British fighting. Sir William Phipps brought ruin to Acadia. Marie-Therese took her young daughter and fled to Montreal and, although they were captured along the way, managed to escape and arrived at her family home in Quebec. In the meantime, Cadillac was given command of Fort Buade. Cadillac left Acadia, and was never to return. On September 11, 1691, La Forest and 110 men, including Alphonse de Tonty, his first officer, left Quebec for Michilimackinac. The French government named Cadillac a captain in the Marines and naval ensign in April of 1694. Cadillac was a favorite lieutenant of Frontenac. He was sent to command the fort at Michilimackinac, located at what is now Mackinac City, Michigan. The settlement had a Jesuit mission, villages of Ottawa and Huron Indians, and some French families. Cadillac assumed the post, which gave him command of all posts and government interests in the West, and held it until 1697, or 1698. As commander of Fort Michilimackinac, Cadillac strengthened ties with the Huron and other nations, but came into conflict with the Jesuit missionaries, there to convert indigenous nations to Catholicism. White traders were exchanging brandy for beaver pelts, and the Jesuits desired to keep the indigenous population free from a dependency on alcohol. In 1695, Duluth, one of the most dauntless pioneer rangers, coureurs de bois, in Canada during the French regime, retired because of lameness. For 30 years he had succeeded in keeping the country to the west of the Great Lakes under French control. Notwithstanding that he had every chance of becoming wealthy, but he died poor, and Governor Vaudreuil testified to his having been a very upright man. Over time, colonists who took part in the fur trade developed a lifestyle adapted to the necessity of living in cooperation with the Aboriginals, including trade partnerships cemented by marriage. Within 2 or 3 generations, the children of the fur trade had developed their own communities, between the trading posts and the native villages, and developed a sense of separate identity. By the 18th century, these villages were major supplier of voyageurs for the Western trade. The men, having grown up inland, were skilled boatmen and traders, and were accustomed to life in the bush. 2. Reckless overtrading in beaver marked the Frontenac era. In 1697, French trading posts in Nouvelle-France were suffering. A 10-year overstock in beaver pelts was having a disastrous effect on the economy. The market in France was saturated, prices in Canada were falling as a result, and Louis XIV decided to reduce the flow of beaver pelts into the colony. In May 1696, Nouvelle-France officially closed all but 4 posts in the west as a result of Jesuit reports about undesirable goings-on at the posts, specifically the trading of brandy to indigenous peoples. An edict was issued suppressing the 25 fur trading licenses, congés, abolishing the principal western posts, and ordering the coureurs de bois to return to civilization. Frontenac, Bouchard, St. Joseph of the Miami, and St. Louis of the Illinois, were all allowed to remain open, only as long as needed by the military. Bouchard and St. Joseph were abandoned immediately by their garrisons, and St. Louis was abandoned by 1702, leaving only Fort Frontenac. Knowing that the abandoned forts were an invitation to the British to take over the area, Cadillac spoke to Frontenac about founding a new settlement in the Detroit area, but Frontenac died before formalizing the agreement. Callieres also realized that this might drive the natives to Albany into the arms of the English. Moreover, the abolition of the posts and licenses made it more difficult to control the Allies and facilitated English infiltration of the West. The governor compelled the newly established Compagnie de la Colonie to sell merchandise to the Indians at special rates, but was unable to re-establish the posts and licenses. On several occasions, Frontenac had ordered a virtual cessation of hostilities to allow Iroquois deputies to come to Quebec with peace proposals, but Callieres greatly doubted that the Iroquois sincerely desired peace. On July 4, 1697, an army of over 2,000 men left Montreal, made up of colonial regular troops, militiamen, and Indian auxiliaries. Later that month the French force disembarked on the south shore of Lake Ontario and advanced on the Onondaga settlements. Callieres, suffering from gout, came in front on a horse which had been specially transported for him from Montreal on a flatboat. Frontenac, feeling the weight of his 74 years, was carried along behind the army in an armchair. Although this force failed to make contact with the enemy, it ravaged the territory of the Onondagas and Oneidas and struck a terrible blow at the fighting spirit of the Iroquois. When Frontenac died on November 28, 1698, Hector Louis de Callieres automatically became acting governor-general. The main problem now facing him was the negotiation of a firm treaty between the Iroquois, Nouvelle-France, and some 30 different tribes, many of whom had been warring on one another or on the Iroquois since time immemorial. 22. Callieres was not too fond of Cadillac and thus did not agree with any plans to found a new settlement lower in the Great Lakes, specifically, in the area south of Lake Huron known as Le Detroit, or the Straits. The area was ideal for settlement because the land was fertile, the location on the river was easily defended against the British and the climate was more hospitable than that of the northern settlements like Michilimackinac. In 1698, Cadillac traveled to France where he convinced Louis XIV and Jérôme Philippiaz, Comte de Pontchartrain, or his father, Louis, Minister of Marine, of the merits of a major settlement on the Detroit River. France considered the savvy, intrepid Cadillac a valuable asset, and the king and royal advisers heeded his arguments for establishing a trading center on the Great Lakes to compete with New York and thwart English ties with the indigenous nations to the west. This had been planned before, but the explorer Duluth instead founded a settlement some 60 miles north, near what is now Port Huron, Michigan. There were only a handful of small Indian settlements in the region, since tribes of the powerful Iroquois nation controlled territory to the south and their enemies maintained lands near the St. Clair River. In 1699, Callieres confiscated the trade goods that 2 Montreal merchants were endeavoring to send to their agents at Michilimackinac. The following year he arrested Laporte de Louvigny, the commandant of Fort Frontenac, for having illegally engaged in the fur trade. By 1700, Champigny and Calliers reported that coureurs de bois were returning to the colony as they exhausted their supplies of trade goods. Cadillac again traveled to France to discredit his doubters and, on May 5, 1700, King Louis sent word that a post was to be established in the Detroit River region and that Cadillac was to be the commandant. King Louis provided 1,500 livres, about $300, to be used to build a fort there at the new settlement. Farmers were to provide food for the settlement and trade would create some financial stability. Senencas. His first official duty after returning to Nouvelle-France, Quebec, came 4 years, or 6 years, after his release when, on July 18, 1723, Senencas was asked to interpret at a conference at Fort Ononage between Chevalier Louis-Hector de Calliers, governor and lieutenant general for the king in Canada, and 6 deputies from the Iroquois, 2 from the Onondaga and 4 from the Seneca. Pledges of peace were made in the figurative language as implored on such occasions, ending the Second Iroquois War. Calliers was solicitous about certain Frenchmen and Indian allies of the French who were still held hostage in Iroquois country. The deputies declared willingness to restore captives but asked as a special favor that Senencas return with them to receive the captives. This request was granted. Father Bruyas and Sieur Paul Lemoyne de Maricourt were sent along with the 2 Onondaga and 4 Seneca chiefs into the Iroquois cantons, Bruyas and Maricourt to the Onondagas. Joncaire, as part of his services to Calliers, spent that summer with the Seneca and managed to prevail upon all nations except the Mohawks to send an official delegation to Quebec to negotiate a treaty with the French and their native allies. The chiefs called Joncaire son and, according to Seneca custom, presented him with 3 belts of wampum, saying, "We give these in consequence of the death of Joncaire's adoptive father, who managed affairs well, and was in favor of peace. We inform Onontia. 24. By these strings of wampum, that we have selected Tonatoc out, the nearest blood relation, to act as his father instead, as he resembles him in his disposition of a kind parent." Calliers approved the appointment of Joncaire as envoy, to convey my word to you and to bring me back yours, so pleasing the chiefs that they consented 4 of their people should remain at Montreal until their return. Calliers at this period was more concerned in making a firm peace with the savages south of Lake Ontario than with getting any foothold on the Niagara. Le Detroit. In 1700 and 1701, Louis XIV consolidated control of Quebec, North America from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, by founding new settlements at Detroit and on the lower Mississippi in Louisiana. Charles II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, had died on November 1, 1700, and bequeathed to Louis XIV's grandson, Philippe d'Anjou, the entire Spanish inheritance. A colony founded on the lower Mississippi would protect Mexico from aggressive designs by the English plantations on the Atlantic coast. A post at Detroit would block English expansionism in the region of the Great Lakes. Thus, France hoped to control all of North America west of the Appalachians and close it to the English. Calliers had serious misgivings. The Iroquois might take offense at a settlement built on their hunting grounds and renew war, or draw the Western allies close to the Iroquois and facilitate the growth of trade relations and a political connection. He urged the re-establishment of the old trading posts and of the licenses as more important for the preservation of the West. Pontchartrain replied that the Detroit project should be put through unless insurmountable difficulties were discovered. Thus, Calliers deferred to ministerial wishes and cooperated with Cadillac to assure the success of his venture. He felt nothing but hostility towards Louisiana, a separate colony carved out of territory hitherto governed from Quebec, and its founder, Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville. On 4, some say 2, June 1701, Cadillac set off for Le Detroit from Montreal with a flotilla of 25 canoes, 50 soldiers, 50 Canadian voyageurs, farmers, traders, and artisans, and natives, which served as guides. The men on this expedition included, Captain Alphonse de Tonty. 25. A loyal and trusted officer, Lieutenants Schockernacle and Dugny, First Sergeant Jacob de Marsac, Sieur de l'Omsprou, Father Constantine del Halle, or de El Halle, a Recollet priest of the Franciscan order, Father François Valiant de Geslis, a Jesuit priest, interpreters, and brothers, Jean and François Fafard de Lorme, and Cadillac's 8 or 9-year-old son, Antoine. 2 other men, Robert Chevalier de Beauchesne, 26, and his 2 elder brothers Paul and Jean, sons of Jacques Chevalier and Jean Villain, were also with the party at first, but when Cadillac checked the canoes at La Chine for extra brandy, he found that there was more than what had been licensed and demanded to know the responsible parties. Chevalier's brother claimed for responsibility for smuggling the alcohol and a fight nearly broke out, but Chevalier stepped in. The party returned to Montreal where Chevalier was imprisoned for 3 days. His brother spent the rest of his life in the wilderness. The remainder of the crew resumed their journey following the old Ottawa route. Thus, avoiding the Niagara Passage so as not to give umbrage to the Iroquois, through fear of disturbing the peace, until I can speak to them to prevent any alarm they might feel at such proceedings, and until I adopt some measures to facilitate the communication and conveyance of necessaries from this to that country through Lake Ontario. The logical course would have been for the party to travel up the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario, then on to Lake Erie and thence to the Straits. However, the Iroquois still dominated the area, making it too dangerous. Instead, they traveled up the Ottawa River to Lake Nipissing, then down the French and Pickerel Rivers to the Georgian Bay, south to Lake Huron, down the St. Clair River, and through Lake St. Clair, reaching the Detroit River on July 23, 1701. They did not stop, but rather traveled slightly south to Grosse Isle, where the party set up camp there and spent the night. The following day, on July 24, 1701, they traveled north on the Detroit River looking for a place to build their settlement. Cadillac chose the narrowest part of the river where the banks were high to begin construction of Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, named for King Louis, Minister of Marine. Some say Louis Philippiaz, Comte du Pontchartrain, some say his son, Jerome, who succeeded him as Minister of Marine in 1698. The name Detroit has its origins in Cadillac's naming of the ville Detroit, or City of the Straits. Building of the storehouse and stockade began immediately. However, the first building completed was St. Anne's Church. Construction was likely started on July 26, the feast day of St. Anne. Father Valiant, intent on trading brandy to the natives and his encouraging marriage between soldiers and Aboriginal women, was unhappy with Cadillac's apparent favoritism of the Franciscan order and left the area almost immediately after the party landed. Thus St. Anne's followed the Franciscan order under the leadership of Father Del Halle. Meanwhile, the new colony of Quick became a refuge for renegade coureurs de bois and other competitors in the fur trade of the interior. Calliers urged Louisiana be placed under his command and that coureurs de bois who retired there after violating the laws of Canada be arrested, and that Louisiana be forbidden to receive beaver pelts and be permitted only the trade in buffalo hides and other products of the southern part of the continent. The minister, however, refused to grant Calliers jurisdiction over Louisiana because it was much easier to send orders there directly from France than by way of Quebec. He also refused to arrest coureurs de bois who had deserted from Canada, since he wished to make use of them to begin the settlement of the new colony. Lawrence Clayson. As early as 1700, Lawrence Clayson, van der Valgen, 27, had been serving the English as interpreter in their councils and treaties with the Five Nations. Even then, no novice at the trade, the Mohawks gave him about 3 acres on small islands in the Mohawk in proof of their gratitude because of his fairness as an interpreter. He was a witness, on July 19, 1701, to the deed by which the Five Nations conveyed their beaver hunting grounds to King William, a document containing among the attached signatures the pictographic deuces of sachems of each of the Five Nations, and quit claiming to the English crown all the country of the Iroquois south of Lakes Ontario and Huron, on both sides of Lake Erie and as far west as Lake Michigan, including the Great Falls Oghjagere, Niagara. A vast area, 400 miles wide by 800 miles long, an empire wilderness which the Iroquois claimed as hunting ground and, because of its resources of fur, the bone of contention between Europe's greatest powers, was absolutely given, freely and voluntarily surrendered, delivered up and forever quit-claimed. Unto our great Lord and Master the King of England called by us Coracu and by the Christians William III, and to his heirs and successors kings and queens of England forever. And, on the part of the Five Nations, the sole compensation for this transfer was to be liberty to hunt as they pleased in this domain and to be protected by the English in the exercise of that right. Lawrence Clayson was the first white man not of France or in French interest known to have visited the Niagara in other than a clandestine way, with the exception of Roosboom and MacGregory and perhaps one or two others of their class. He was a typical example of a class of men who at this period were indispensable alike to the English and French, Indian interpreter, go-between, and medium of communication between the English and the Indians. Though not a soldier, he was for his people in other ways the counterpart of John Cayer among the French. 3. John Cayer spent the summer of 1700 among the Senecas in the furtherance of his mission, though there were no permanent Seneca villages at this time. By September 3 he was back again at Montreal from the Onondagas with Father Bruyas and Sieur de Maricourt, 3 men who enjoyed great prestige among the Iroquois, and 19 deputies representing all the nations except the Mohawks to speak in favor of a treaty, bringing 13 prisoners for restoration to the French, liberated by the Iroquois as proof of the sincerity of their intentions. These delegates met with those of the Mission Indians, Abenakis, Hurons, and Ottawas, and peace terms were agreed upon. Calliers then announced a great assembly the following summer when prisoners would be exchanged and the treaty solemnly ratified. For some years following, John Cayer often sojourned amongst the Onondaga or the Seneca on missions to secure the release of prisoners or to spy on the emissaries of the English or interpreting at councils. In negotiations of the time he was indispensable. At the General Council at Montreal in the summer of 1701, at which assembled not only representatives of the Iroquois but of the tribes from Mackinac and the western tribes which, after great difficulty, had been induced to send hither French and Iroquois prisoners for exchange. As their canoes came in sight of the town the occupants raised their paddles in salute and French cannon returned the greeting. By July, 1,300 savage warriors of over 30 different tribes from areas as far apart as the Atlantic coast and the headwaters of the Mississippi had assembled and the sessions began. For several days, delegation after delegation appeared before Calliers with charges and countercharges, claims and counterclaims. As expected, the return of the prisoners proved to be the most troublesome point. Here appeared L'Irat, greatest and most eloquent red man of his day, intelligent and noble of character. L'Irat delivered over to Calliers his Iroquois prisoners and demanded to know why the Five Nations was not delivering up theirs. They were not acting in good faith. The Iroquois replied, through their orator taken out, that the hostages, whether they were French or native it mattered not, were unwilling to leave and had forgotten their own people and were attached to those who had adopted them, or had been killed in captivity. A few days afterward, the council being still in session, L'Irat died. The body of the great Huron chief lay in state at the Hotel Dieu, in an officer's uniform, with side arms, for he held the rank and pay of an officer in the French army. After the Governor-General and Intendant had sprinkled the corpse with holy water, John Cayer/Sinankes led 60 warriors from Sault St. Louis to the bier where they wept for the dead, bewailing him in Indian fashion and covered him, a figurative expression which signifies that they gave presents to his tribesmen. After the imposing funeral, at which the ritual of the Roman Catholic Church was blended with military usage and Indian rites, Sinankes led another band of Iroquois to condole with and compliment the Hurons with significant gifts of wampum. It is no small tribute to Calliers' ability that a treaty could be drawn up. All the tribes agreed to live at peace and take their grievance to our father Onontio, the governor of Nouvelle France, who would obtain redress. Equally important, Calliers extracted a promise from the Iroquois to remain neutral in any future conflict between the French and the English. Between 1701 and 1703 there would be a significant population increase due, in part, to peace with the Iroquois, which opened up more efficient routes to the area. Travel west, though, was not only made easier for the French, but for the British, as well. The War of the Spanish Succession broke out. 4. The Jesuit missionary François Valiant was on the Niagara, in 1701, when he met the Huron chief 40 souls, 40 Sioux, whom seemed to have been constantly passing up and down the lakes and was a familiar and influential figure in the Niagara region. In the summer of 1701, Marie-Therese Guyon du Buisson, age 30, daughter of a well-to-do Quebec merchant, resolved to join her husband in the West. She chose to go by the Niagara route. Engaging an escort of experienced French Canadian voyageurs to guide her canoe flotilla, she set out from Quebec on September 10, 1701 with her 7, or 9-year-old son Jacques, Le Petit Cadillac. She was joined at Montreal by Anne Picotte Belestre, age 30, wife of Alphonse de Tonty, Cadillac's second in command at Detroit, going to live with her husband in Detroit, and a few other women, wives of soldiers and servants, and an escort of Canadians. They came to Fort Frontenac, where they passed the winter. As soon as the ice allowed, in the spring, they followed the south shore of Ontario and entered the Niagara. Madame Cadillac, Madame de Tonty and their attendants, lovely in person, energetic and capable to an exceptional degree, were the first non-Aboriginal women to traverse the Niagara portage and, indeed, the first to pass through any of the Great Lakes. It was a dangerous adventure covering nearly 1,000 miles by canoe. Nothing ever astonished the Iroquois so greatly as when they saw them, particularly the Iroquois which kissed their hands and wept for joy, saying that French women had never been seen coming willingly to their country. They reasoned that the proclaimed peace was indeed sincere, since women of this rank came amongst them with confidence. In the following years, wives and children and other relatives of officers, soldiers and tradesmen at Detroit, similarly passed, usually with the convoys. Sometimes the relatives went with the officers, and if there were hardship and danger, there were gaiety and good cheer as well. At a council at Onondaga, in September 1701, John Cayer/Sinenkes encountered Captain Johannes Bleecker and David Schuyler, sent from Fort Orange. 28. To hinder the French debauching of our Indians. John Cayer had brought an abundance of the goods, a part of the store intended for the families who consented to release their prisoners in exchange. Bleecker, his chief concern to secure the trade of the Five Nations, even the control of the Niagara River, was irritated at the success which John Cayer/Sinenkes and his fellows had among our Indians, and said, "We understand the French are come here to trade. Do you send for us to come with such people? If you send for us for every Frenchman that comes to trade with you, we shall have work enough, and if you will hearken to them they will keep you in alarm continually. We know this is the contrivance of the priests to plague you continually upon pretense of peace and talk to you until you are mad, and as soon as these are got home, the Jesuits have another project. If you will break your cranes with such things, we advise you, brethren, when the French comes again, let them smoke their pipe and give them their bellyful of victuals and let them go." On October 31, 1701, a contract between Louis XIV and the Company of the Colony of Canada, an all-Canadian fur company set up by Governor Calliers in order to strip Cadillac of all trade rights with hopes of saving and then growing the economy, gave the Company of the Colony total control of, and responsibility for, Forts Frontenac and Pontchartrain. Cadillac was to become an employee of the company, which he was not made aware of until Messrs. Arnauld and Radisson, representatives from the Company of the Colony, arrived at Fort Pontchartrain to take over on July 18, 1702. Hillage van Olinda Hillage Cornelies van Olinda, 29. Was employed as interpretress at Albany in 1702. She married Albany businessman, a tailor, and regional property holder Peter Daniels van Olinda. 5. As commander of Fort Pontchartrain, Cadillac immediately established cordial relations with nearby Ottawa, Huron, Potawatomi, Miami, and Wyandot tribes. They were encouraged to group together in villages near the fort for mutual protection against both Iroquois and English enemies. there were only a few dozen soldiers stationed at Fort Pontchartrain, and Cadillac lobbied unsuccessfully for Christianized Indian women from Michilimackinac to be brought to Detroit as brides for his men, a plan the Jesuits opposed. Cadillac's own wife arrived in 1702, after leaving two of their daughters behind at a convent in Quebec. Marie-Therese Guyon du Buisson and Picotte Belestre, wife of Alphonse de Tonty, having made an arduous trek of almost 1,000 miles in open canoe to become the first European women settlers in Detroit, arrived thereat in May of 1702. 2 months later, on July 21, 1702, Cadillac left for Quebec, to make an attempt at regaining control of the fort and its operations, but failed and returned to Fort Pontchartrain on November 6, 1702. Arnauld and Radisson held a very different policy regarding trade with natives, whilst Cadillac had tried to foster trust with the indigenous people, allowing them access to the fort. Arnauld and Radisson kept the warehouse and other buildings locked and made changes in the distribution of brandy. Cadillac's efforts to restore trust and happiness at the fort were hindered by the natives' dismay at learning that he was subordinate to the king in France, believing that if the post was undesirable enough, the company would lose interest in it. Cadillac did not try too hard to improve conditions, though. Several villages of natives had established in the area. An Ottawa village was built near the foot of Belle Isle, a Miami village was built along the river east of the fort, a Potawatomi village was built near the mouth of Nags Creek, a Wolf village was built nearby in the King's Commons, but he also says that Wolf was a division of the Sauk tribe. Later, on June 28, 1703, 30 Wyandot, or Huron, families arrived from St. Ignace and established a village in the area that is now the foot of 3rd Street. Cadillac remained in command of the soldiers but was no longer responsible for maintaining the garrison. In autumn of 1703, 9 soldiers deserted but came back and were pardoned. In the same year, an arsonist set fire to Fort Pontchartrain and St. Ian's Church, the Recollet residence, and Cadillac's home were all damaged. Cadillac was badly burned. Around this time, Cadillac was made aware of a plan between Tonty and the Jesuits of Michilimackinac to establish a new post in St. Joseph on Lake Michigan. Tonty admitted to the plot and was pardoned by Cadillac. On Ascension Day in May 1703, Calliers was attending Mass in the Quebec Cathedral when he suffered a hemorrhage and began to vomit blood. On May 23, 1703, at the Château St. Louis, Quebec, Notary Louis Chamballon was summoned to his bedside to draw up the dying man's last will and testament. He left everything to his brother-in Marquis de Calliers. The following day he was dead. The type of governor whom people fear and obey but do not love, Calliers had been resented for his severity, his imperious ways, the inflexible manner in which he enforced royal orders, but also respected for his integrity and his high concept of public duty. Calliers was one of the principal artisans of the French victory during the Second Iroquois War, the diplomat who negotiated the Great Peace of 1701, and the strategist who shaped New France's policy for the War of the Spanish Succession. In the history of the colony, there probably never was an abler and more devoted servant of the French monarchy. 30. On November 11, 1702, La Forest and Charlotte Françoise Juchereau were married. They had one child which died in infancy. 6. Governor Philippe de Rigaud de Vaudreuil took his place at the head of administration in Nouvelle-France after the death of Governor Chevalier de Calliers, and, like his predecessor, he had had experience with the Seneca in his native wilds. In a letter to Pontchartrain, dated November 14, 1703, his first communication after the death of Calliers, Vaudreuil speaks of the recent return of Joncaire from a 3-month sojourn among the Senecas and declares the intention of sending him back to winter amongst them. This he did, but at the first breaking up of the ice in the spring, Joncaire appeared at Fort Frontenac with the news that the English were preparing to hold a general meeting of the Iroquois at Onondaga, the great capital of the Iroquois. The neutrality of the Five Nations had now become the chief object of solicitude for the French. Joncaire was sent back to the Seneca with the priest Valiant, so that their combined efforts might defeat the seductive overtures of the English. John Caire and Charles Lemoyne de Longueuil, whom wielded great influence over the Onondagas, were chosen by Vaudreuil to preserve Iroquois neutrality. Pontchartrain urged the governor to conclude an offensive alliance with the Iroquois and authorized him to strike a major blow at the English colonies, and the governor authorized the Abenakis to resume the border warfare interrupted by the Treaty of Ryswick. John Caire alternately appealed to the interests of the Senecas by presenting them with gifts and played upon their fears by threatening them with an attack by the Western Indians if they should break their treaty with Nouvelle France. The traditional policy of the Iroquois was to exclude the Western Indians from the Albany trade, if they granted them a right of way to that city, as the half-breed agent Montour, who was employed by the New York merchants, was urging them to do. The Western Indians would no longer have compelling reasons to make war on the Five Nations. On Vaudreuil's orders, John Caire set out to eliminate Montour. Once more at Onondaga, John Caire met an old adversary, Peter Schuyler. The Indians were as ready to listen to overtures from one party as the other. This attitude alarmed the French. Under the sanction of the French at this time, Indian parties fell upon certain New England settlements with dire results. John Caire shared in the instigation of these attacks. He was also an intermediary in negotiations with the Senecas, regarding an attack upon them by the Ottawas. In 1704, Company of the Colony sent a clerk to investigate Cadillac. Cadillac had the man jailed, left Tonty in charge of the settlement and went to Quebec, where he was arrested. Upon being released from jail and allowed to return to Detroit, Cadillac found that Tonty, whom was suspected of allying with the Jesuits to establish a trading post at Port Huron, along with a company commissioner, had been embezzling goods for illegal fur trade. Cadillac filed the offense with Vaudreuil, but Tonty's accomplice was a relative of Vaudreuil and a countersuit was filed against Cadillac, whom was acquitted, but barred from returning to Fort Pontchartrain. Cadillac presented his case to Pontchartrain and Vaudreuil agreed to let Cadillac go back to Fort Pontchartrain. Tonty was removed from Fort Pontchartrain, but was later pardoned by Cadillac and allowed to return, whereafter he continued to plot against his former friend with some of the natives. Despite these and other conflicts, the Detroit settlement grew over the next few years and began to thrive economically. The area's first officially recorded birth came with his daughter, Marie-Therese Cadillac, in 1704. At least 4 other Cadillac offspring were born there, but 3 died before the age of 5. On June 14, 1705, the Company of the Colony made a new agreement restoring full control of Fort Pontchartrain to Cadillac. Hostilities between indigenous nations increased, threatening the stability of the fort. Reports reached Count Pontchartrain that Cadillac was defying royal decree and trading brandy for pelts. François Clarambalt de Gramont, a commissioner, was dispatched to investigate. Cadillac had first passed through the lower lakes going to Detroit by the Ottawa route in 1702, in the summer of 1706, while on Lake Ontario, returning from Quebec, 4 or 5 boats did not get on so well as the others, and finally disappeared. Cadillac sent a figure to find them and bring them to Irondequoit, Fort of the Sables, a convenient stopping place, but not a fortification. There he did wait, 8 days. Finally he went on with a Seneca escort of 26 men led by a chief Twaidecourt. Reaching Detroit, Cadillac wrote to the Marquis de Vaudreuil, asking that the deserters be arrested. I hope you will send back the wives of Chanteloup and Laroche de Strs, also the men John and Parisian of my company, with their wives, these 2 rascals having deserted or taken a holiday out of mere wantonness. He further states that these men, in coming through Lake Ontario, had put in at the Bay of Goyaguin, Sodus, and visited the large village of Sonantois to take letters to the Jesuit who resides there, who apparently charged them to take the answers to Montreal. The Iroquois promised Cadillac they would escort the missing Frenchmen up to the portage at Niagara. John did go to Fort Sables, whilst the others went down the river. Cadillac thought they deserved to pass the winter in prison, but wanted them sent back to Detroit in the spring. Much has been said of the lawless character of the forest rangers, unscrupulous traders, and loose-living boatmen and soldiers. One may not conclude that such was the character of all. Many who figure here were of the other social extreme. Most of the officers of the military and many a civilian called by duty to these lakes bore names long honored among the noblesse of France. Many a younger son of a noble family turned to service in the New World wilderness, tempted by the certainty of adventure or the chance of preferment and distinction, if not by the substantial offers of land grants and bounties with which Louis XIV lured them on. Thus it came about that even as the feudal system was dying out in France, it was revived and continued in Canada, by the granting to prominent colonists or soldiers of achievement tracts of land called seigneuries. Most of these, on the St. Lawrence and its tributaries, were of a half-league waterfront with a depth of 2 or 3 leagues. To these seigneuries were given the ancestral or place names with which the family had been identified in France. As the seigneuries were divided for sons and sons' sons, so seigneurial designations multiplied, so that brothers figure in our history by different appellations, and sons lose their patronymic in common usage. Most of those who went to the Detroit and elsewhere in the West, during the early years of the 18th century, were born on the lower St. Lawrence, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, Montreal, but their parents as a rule were born in Normandy or neighboring provinces. On March 1, 1706, at Montreal, Louis Thomas Gilbert de Joncaire married 31 Marie Magdeleine Légué de Bully. 32. Age 17, daughter of Jean-Jérôme Légué, Sieur de Bully, 33 merchant and bourgeois of Montreal, and Magdeleine just 34. Of the 10 children born of this marriage between 1707 and 1723, several died in infancy, 2 played a part in the colony's history. 35. 7. In 1706, after Cadillac had been given exclusive control of the settlement on the Detroit, there was a notably large migration thither from the old St. Lawrence towns. One list enumerates 48 persons who with their possessions went in the summer to share the fortunes of the new colony, most of them journeyed by the Niagara route. In May 1706, Jean and Paul Oghjagere, 2 brothers, brought 10 head of cattle and 3 horses, the first domestic animals known to have been taken west of Lake Ontario. The greatest travel to the westward during French control in this region was in 1749, one record of 1750 mentions the passing of 12 families, composed of 57 persons, up the Niagara bound for Detroit. On June 6, 1706, Cadillac left Lieutenant Etienne Vignard, Sieur du Bourgmont in charge of Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit while he traveled to Montreal and Quebec. One day, an Ottawa man looking around outside Bourgmont's quarters was bitten by the dog of a native of a different tribe. The Ottawa man kicked the dog in retaliation. Bourgmont heard the dog howl and upon finding the Ottawa man, beat him unconscious. When other Ottawas heard of the offense, they were angered and drunk and took their aggressions out on a group of Miamis camped nearby. The Ottawa felt the French were plotting against them, so they attacked the Miami village, killing 6 people. Feeling a need to protect the Miamis, Bourgmont ordered the fort gates closed and the garrison and the Miamis to fire on the Ottawas, killing 30 of them. Many others fled. Father Nicolas Constantin Del Halle, a Recollet priest, and a solitaire named Riviere were also killed during the melee. After returning to Fort Pontchartrain, Cadillac had the Ottawa leader, Chief Le Peasant, jailed and promised his head to the Miamis. Then, he secretly helped the chief escape from the fort, and the area, in order to free him without appearing to break his promise. The Miamis responded by killing 3 settlers and 1 of Cadillac's cows. Cadillac retaliated by attacking the Miami village on the St. Joseph River, despite orders to use diplomacy rather than violence in dealing with indigenous peoples. Bourgmont had left the settlement, along with a few soldiers and a woman named Ticonet, before Cadillac returned. The group was camped on the shores of Lake Erie, where they were pursued by officials sent by Cadillac. Only one was arrested. He was tried and shot. The others escaped. 36. Pontchartrain ordered an investigation into the matter. There was nothing much to Detroit, a few hundred arpents of poor land growing Indian corn, most of it belonging to Cadillac or the Wyandottes. 29 soldiers had married and settled 49 arpents, building small houses of stakes set in the ground with thatched roofs. There was a rotting palisade with 2 bastions so small and of such extraordinary shape as to be unrecognizable. Cadillac was a tyrant, exacting fees on every pretext, giving the soldiers short rations, controlling to his profit the brandy trade that had become the post's raison d'etre. There were battles among the allied tribes and new treaties had to be negotiated by the Wyandottes and Miamis with the Iroquois, and a brisk trade in beaver to the English at Albany by the cheapness of their goods were the results of founding Detroit. François de la Forest, whom had commanded the post in 1705 in Cadillac's absence, was called to replace Cadillac, but his age and health forced him to refuse the commission. He suggested that Charles Regnault, Sieur Dubuisson, or Joseph Guyon, Sieur Dubuisson, take the commission in his place. Many original settlers left Detroit at this time, especially those without families and those who were friends of Cadillac's. The population experienced such a dramatic decrease that Dubuisson decided to shrink the size of the palisades by 1/2, leaving half of the settlement unprotected. The villagers sent a letter to Cadillac voicing their unhappiness, but he was powerless to help them. It was urged that the English would take no alarm if Joncaire, this good friend of the Senecas, this soldier who lived with the Indians in their lodges, should go to the banks of the Niagara. Without noise, going there as a private individual intending simply to form an establishment for his family, at first bringing only the men he will require to erect and fortify his dwelling, and afterwards on pretense of conveying supplies and merchandise there, increasing their number insensibly, and when the Iroquois would see that goods would be furnished them at a reasonable rate, far from insulting us, they would protect and respect us, having no better friends than those who supply them at a low rate. A monopoly of the beaver trade at Niagara could be secured. It was necessary to undersell the English, a thing which the French at this period could not do, especially in the price of powder and lead, which the English furnished very cheaply to the Indians. Niagara was claimed to be the best of all points for trade with the Iroquois. It would serve as an entrepot to the establishment at Detroit. With a bark on Lake Ontario, goods could be brought from Fort Frontenac to the Niagara in a couple of days, with less risk of loss than by the existing canoe transportation. It was considered that, by this establishment we should have a fortress among the Iroquois which would keep them in check, a refuge for our Indian allies in case of need, and a barrier that would prevent them going to trade with the English, as they begin to do this year, it being the place at which they cross. It would be of much greater advantage and less expense than carrying on a war against Indians excited by the English, but, to maintain the king's authority, it would be necessary to prevent all the improper commerce hitherto carried on by the transportation of brandy into the forest, which had hitherto been the cause of all existing disorders and evils. On June 30, 1707, François Clarambald de Gramont, who was serving as subdelegate to Intendant Sieur Bouchard at Quebec, was instructed by Versailles to visit Fort Cataraqua, i.e. Frontenac, now Kingston, Ontario, Niagara, Detroit, and Missilimakinac, to verify their present condition, the trade carried on there and the utility they may be to the colony of Canada. Contradictory reports informed of the English endeavoring to seize the post at Niagara. It is of very great importance for the preservation of Canada to prevent them so doing, because were they masters of it, they would bar the passage and obstruct the communication with the Indian allies of the French, whom as well as the Iroquois they would attract to them by their trade, and dispose, whenever they please, to wage war on the French. This would desolate Canada and oblige us to abandon it. A post at Niagara could serve as an entrepot to Detroit and facilitate intercourse with it by means of bark on Lake Ontario. Such a post was of infinite importance for the maintenance of the colony of Canada, and could be accomplished by Joncaire, whom Vaudreuil kept among the Iroquois for the purpose of carrying on profitable trade with them and of destroying the establishment at Detroit. Sieur de Gramont was to examine whether the project would be of as great importance for a colony as suggested, and, in such case, to inquire with Joncaire, whether it would be possible to obtain the consent of the Iroquois to have a fort and garrison there, and conjointly, make a detailed report of the means which would be necessary to effect it and the expense it would require, finally to ascertain whether it would be desirable that he should have an interview with Joncaire at Niagara. De Gramont did not undertake his mission until the following summer. 8. It was the presence of Joncaire and the traders who relied on his influence with the natives that drew the nomadic Mississauga in the vicinity in 1707. Their later occupancy of the Niagara region is less definite than that of the Senecas, as conditions of sustenance or warfare suggest. They were probably the same people who had greeted La Salle in 1678 and seem to have shifted about in the region east of Lake Huron and north of Lake Erie. Word was carried to Albany that two sachems of a western nation called Versailles, which is held to mean the same as Mississauga, were come to the Senecas country to acquaint the Five Nations that there were 3 castles of their countrymen come to settle at a place about 8 miles above Oghjagere, Niagara. The reference is not to the falls but to the mouth of the river, and the proposed settlement was later known as the Mississauga village near Chippewa Creek. In 1707, Joncaire was sent farther afield on a mission among the Illinois. His first-hand knowledge of native culture ensured that the Seneca would not be insulted by improper gifts, impositions, or pressuring by other French agents which were accustomed to European ways of creating alliances and trade networks. English agents in Seneca territory were initially outdone by the French because men like Joncaire respected all of the ceremonial, time-consuming, and gift-giving elements of Seneca councils, but the English proved impatient and impulsively dictated terms to the Seneca, using trade with Albany as either the reward or punishment for meeting English terms. Joncaire provided French colonial administrators with an inside man capable of swaying Seneca opinions that went unmatched by the fumbling British in Albany. His extraordinary value came from the fact that he fully understood and appreciated the important role persuasion played in a culture where no person had the power to compel obedience. In 1707, Cadillac led a force against the Miamis and brought them to terms. Among the things which Cadillac thought essential to the welfare of Detroit was the destruction of Fort Frontenac, a new fort to be built 25 leagues lower down at a place called La Palette Galette, near present Ogdensburg, to be rid of the difficulties of the Niagara portage. In May 1708, word reached Albany that the French were about to build at Oghjagere, the Great Falls. In July, Indians warned the English of evil designs intended by the French, who keep a party of men at the carrying place of Jagark. 9. De Gramont, on June 5, 1708, set out from Montreal in a large canoe, amply provisioned but carrying no merchandise for trade, and so well did his sturdy men ply their paddles up the swift St. Lawrence and through the tortuous channels of the Thousand Isles, coasting the uncertain lakes, fickle seas even in midsummer, making the great carry around the cataract of Niagara and hastening by lake and river that they accomplished the journey as far as Missilimakinac, stopping at the designated points only long enough to observe and take testimony, and were back again at Montreal on September 12. So that, allowing an average passage to France, more than a year and a half elapsed from the day when the king made known his will regarding a special investigation into the lake posts till he received the report of his emissary. After pointing out the difficulty of keeping the Indians from carrying their peltries to the English and the advisability of maintaining and strengthening Fort Frontenac, de Gramont continued on to tell of his visit at Niagara. Captain de Tonty, whom was deeply in debt, was in command at Fort Frontenac. De Gramont took the depositions of Indian chiefs and other principal men, much of it tending to show that Tonty pursued an arbitrary and selfish policy in his dealings both with Indian hunters and French soldiers. De Gramont left Fort Frontenac on June 20, 1708, and on the 27th rounded the point that marks the mouth of the Niagara. It had taken him a week to follow the north and west shores of the lake from Tonty's disturbed establishment. Joncaire had been apprised of his coming and met him at the site of the former fort and spoke of the advantages being derived from this post, By fortifying it and placing a garrison there, a number of Iroquois would separate from their villages and establish there, by whom it could always be learned as to what would be going on in those villages and amongst the English, and that it would thereby be easy to obviate all expeditions organized against them. The Iroquois would trade off their all the moose, deer, and bearskins, as these peltries could not be transported to the English except by land, and consequently with considerable trouble. The Mississauguettes, otherwise called the Roundheads, settled at Lake St. Clair, who also convey a great many peltry to the English, would not fail in like manner to trade off their moose, deer, and bearskins there, and the Miamis, having, like the Mississauguettes, demanded by a belt of the Iroquois a passage through their country to Orange to make their trade, would not fail to sell likewise at Niagara the skins that are difficult to transport by land, more particularly as the English esteemed them but little. The evil which would arise was that all the beaver brought thither by any nations whatsoever would pass to the English by means of their low-priced merchandise, unless by selling the French goods at the same rate as the English but prices of goods afforded at Detroit, if carried by canoes to Niagara, would still be much higher than those of the English and, therefore, would not prevent them drawing away from Detroit all the beaver that would be brought to a post at Niagara. De Gramont thought there was so little prospect for establishing a post at Niagara that he did not take the trouble to report any estimate of the expense such a project would incur, but Vaudreuil sent Joncaire to the Iroquois every year with stores of powder, lead and other articles for the Indians. To some he gives, to others trades or sells, distributing to them as if it were coming from himself, thereby obliging the Indians to make him presents, and brings back from those parts a great many peltries. Conflicting reports accuse Joncaire of abusing the trust placed in him in the distribution of goods and turning government supplies to his own profit. On his last voyage, he brought 2 full canoes, leaving one at the head of the Isle de Montreal, and had the peltries clandestinely carted in through the night. Even though chargeable with undue thrift, Pontchartrain felt Joncaire was the best man to manage the Iroquois in the French interest. There is in Canada an officer named Joncaire, interpreter with the Iroquois. His conduct is equivocal. Some say he is a man not merely necessary but faithful, worthy of all confidence. In November 1708, Governor Vaudreuil commended Joncaire in a letter to the minister as possessing every quality requisite to ensure success. He is daring, liberal, speaks the Seneca language in great perfection, and hesitates not whenever it is necessary to decide. Joncaire at this period, 1708-9, was much of the time at Onondaga doing what he could to counterbalance English influence, a task which grew more and more difficult yearly. Although Joncaire retained the goodwill of the Iroquois, and especially of the Seneca, he saw the hold of the French upon them gradually weakened by the temptations of English trade, which was gradually and effectively strengthening. There came a critical time when Schuyler and others in the English interest were very active at Onondaga. Reports reached Vaudreuil that the Iroquois were declaring war against the French and warriors were setting out from Fort Orange to strike a blow. The French missionaries, Lamberville and Meruel, were frightened or cajoled into leaving. A party of drunken Indians had burned the chapel and priest's house at Onondaga, being set on there too, the French believed, by Schuyler. Joncaire and his soldiers were some 45 miles away at Sodus-Bay when this happened. He sent a letter by canoe from Sodus-Bay, Bay of the Cayugas, to de la Fresnière, commanding at Fort Frontenac. Affairs are in such confusion here that I do not consider my soldiers safe. I send them to you to await me at your fort, because should things take a bad turn for us, I can escape if alone more readily than if I have them with me. It is not necessary, however, to alarm Canada yet, as there is no need to despair. I shall be with you in 20 or 25 days at farthest, and if I exceed that time, please send my canoe to Montreal. Letters for the General will be found in my portfolio, which my wife will take care to deliver to him. If, however, you think proper to forward them sooner, St. Louis will hand them to you. But I beg of you that my soldiers may not be the bearers of them, calculating with certainty to find them with you when I arrive, unless I exceed 25 days. The Reverend Father de Lamberville has placed us in a terrible state of embarrassment by his flight. Yesterday, I was leaving for Montreal in the best possible spirits. How, I am not certain if I shall ever see you again. I am, sir and dear friend, your most humble and most obedient servant, alarmed for the safety of himself and men. Regaining his assurance, Joncaire went back amongst the Senecas. The assassination of Louis Coucy Montour. Towards the end of April 1709, Joncaire, Jean Coeur, and his men were with Father de Lamberville at Fort Ononage in Iroquois country at a place called Osirota, upon the creek that lies opposite Cayugas, Sodas Bay, when they happened to encounter the half-breed interpreter Louis Coucy Montour with 10 sachems of the western tribes on their way to Albany. There was a clash of rival interests. Montour was trying to persuade them not to go to war against the Five Nations. Jean Coeur advised Montour to go back or the Five Nations would kill him, upon which Montour replied that he preferred to continue on his journey to Albany. Feigning friendliness, Jean Coeur then desired him to smoke, and Montour replied that he had no tobacco. Jean Coeur then gave him a little, and Montour took out his knife to cut it. Jean Coeur then asked what he did with such a little knife, and desired Montour to give it him with the promise that he would give him one that was better. As soon as Jean Coeur had the knife, he flung it away. At the same time there stood a French soldier behind Montour with a hatchet under his coat, who cut Montour into his head and killed him, whereupon the 10 sachems come to Cayuga with Montour would have killed the Jean Coeur and all his company if it had not been for Montour's brother-in-law who prevented it. One reason for Joncaire's enmity towards Montour was that the latter had turned traitor to the French and not only thwarted their aims among the Iroquois but, whenever Montour could, he induced bands of Western Indians bringing furs for trade to take them to Albany rather than barter with Joncaire. Later this year, Joncaire, and a band of some 40 Senecas, as escort, went to Montreal with Father Dehue and a French blacksmith which had been for some rears in the Seneca villages. Meanwhile, Lawrence Clayson had been sent into Seneca country unto the Five Nations to watch the motions of the French and persuade the Indians to give a free passage to far Indians through their country to come here to Albany to trade. At Onondaga on July 17 he encountered Longueuil and Joncaire. 10. It was from Joncaire that the Governor Vaudreuil received the first intelligence of preparations which the English were making at Boston and elsewhere to attack Canada. In July 1710, the French took alarm lest the Iroquois should join the English and threaten expedition against Canada. Longueuil and Joncaire, with 10 other Frenchmen and some Indians, hastened to Onondaga, where the French, through Joncaire, as interpreter, made an exceedingly vigorous harangue, threatening the Indians with dire vengeance if they shared in the hostile movement. If you do, we will not only come ourselves, but set the far nations upon you to destroy you, your wives and children, root and branch. Be quiet and set still. There was a divided sentiment in this council, but finally the French influence appeared to prevail, though a delegation of Indians soon appeared in Albany to inform Governor Robert Hunter of all that was said, and to receive English assurances of friendship. On the other hand, Vaudreuil, later reporting the matter to Pontchartrain, remembered the services of Joncaire and Longueuil, who exposed themselves to being burnt alive for the preservation of the country in keeping peace with the Iroquois who would inevitably make war. Joncaire had the same influence among the Senecas that Longueuil had with the Onondagas. Notwithstanding, the preceding summer, Joncaire was obliged to send back his soldiers, in fear lest they would be put in the kettle, exposing himself alone to the caprice of these people in order to endeavor to keep the peace. At this time, the French flattered themselves that they could count on the friendship of all of the Five Nations except the Mohawks, who were most under English influence. When Ramezay marched against the English in 1710, Joncaire/Senanquis commanded the Iroquois from Sault St. Louis and the mountain which made up the rear of the army, and he was probably with Vaudreuil in September of that year in the advance to Chambly in quest of the English. In 1710 and again in 1711, Joncaire continued to go back and forth between Montreal, where he acted as interpreter, and the Seneca villages, where he was supposed to offset the influences of the English, chiefly as made manifest through Peter Schuyler. Cadillac was removed from duty at Fort Pontchartrain and, in November 1710, was made governor of the French province of Louisiana. 37. Cadillac left the village in 1711, and La Forest was appointed to succeed him as commandant of Fort Pontchartrain, but, because of his age and health, he was compelled to recommend Charles Regnault, Sieur du Buisson, instead. Lawrence Clayson was among the Indians at Onondaga again in the spring of 1711, and 2 years later he was with Heinrich Hansen and Captain Johannes Bleecker holding an important conference at the same great rendezvous. In August 1711, Nouvelle France was being threatened with an English attack, and Vaudreuil had a great war banquet in Montreal at which 700 or 800 warriors from a dozen different tribes assembled to renew the alliance with them. John Cayer/Senenquis and Michel Marais de la Chauvennerie brandished the hatchet and sang the war song in Onontio's name, a title used by North American Indians of the Great Lakes region to refer to the governor of New France. This was on receipt of the news that the English were preparing to attack Quebec. Many of the Indians answered John Cayer's war cry with applause. Only the Indians from the upper country hesitated, because they had been trading with the English, but in the end, 20 Detroit Hurons took up the hatchet and all who were present declared themselves allies to the French. The next year, in 1712, John Cayer was in command at Fort Frontenac in place of La Fresnière, whom was incapacitated by fever. At this time the Seneca were much disturbed over matters to the west, fearing the event of an outbreak against Detroit or that the tribes at the Sault would beset on the Niagara side. They sent a large delegation to Vaudreuil in Montreal, declaring that they should not speak unless John Cayer were present. John Cayer arrived from Fort Frontenac in September, and the Seneca made their usual pledges of confidence in the French, but the other tribes assembled at Onondaga expressed their decided preference for the English, sending word to the Indians at the Sault to remain passive on their mats, and not to take any sides. The Foxes, Sacs, and Mascoutins were living in the Detroit area the winter of 1711-1712, having moved there from Green Bay. Fighting broke out between the three tribes and the other tribes in the area. Cadillac showed favor to the Wyandots and Ottawas by offering them the protection of the fort. In response, the Foxes then built a small, stockade village which was sieged by their enemies. In May of 1712, Fort Pontchartrain was attacked by 1,000 Foxes and Sacs with Mascoutin and Oghjagere reinforcements. The Fox, Meshquaquehug, were living in the area between Saginaw Bay and Thunder Bay at the time Detroit was founded. The French called the tribe Regnard. They were allied with the Sacs and Mascoutin. The Mascoutins were living on the Fox River in present-day Wisconsin and several other places, including southwest of Lake Huron, west of the south end of Georgian Bay, and on the Ohio River near the mouth of the Wabash River. Until 1634, no white man had seen the Mascoutins. The Oghjagere, an allied tribe of the Foxes and Sacs, were living in the Grand Traverse Bay area at the time Detroit was founded. Only 33 soldiers were stationed at Fort Pontchartrain at the time. Local Wyandots, Hurons, and Ottawas were on an annual Western war raid. The attackers fired blazing arrows into the settlement. St. Anne's Church and other buildings were torn down to reduce the risk of fire. The Wyandots and Ottawas had left their elder men and boys behind when they went on the warpath to the Mississippi Valley. The fastest of the young boys ran toward the Mississippi Valley to bid the warriors return, and there ensued 19 days of fighting. After being holed up inside their fortress for 19 days without food, the Foxes tried to escape and were slaughtered by the others. When the Foxes and Mascoutins fled the area, the French, Wyandots and Ottawa followed them, and many of the Foxes were killed. In the end, no Foxes, Sacs, or Mascoutins remained in the Detroit area. In the summer of 1712, François de la Forest returned to Fort Pontchartrain and took command, Dubuisson serving as his second. In that same year, Jacques-Charles Sabravois, Sieur de Bleury, 38, was appointed commandant of Fort Pontchartrain, but he did not arrive until 1714. From the time of Forest's death on October 16, 1714 to the time of Sabrevois' arrival, Dubuisson again held command. Sabrevois used his own money to try to repair and reinforce the fort, once trying to get villagers to help, but he didn't get very far before he was recalled to Nouvelle France. In September of 1712, Cadillac gave exclusive trading rights in Louisiana to Parisian Antoine Crozet. In 1713, Cadillac took up his position as the governor of Louisiana. During the next few years, Cadillac made several expeditions in search of resources to support the Louisiana settlements. Thus delivering another blow to Cadillac's original vision for Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac was built in 1715, at present-day Mackinaw City, as a headquarters for French trading. Michilimackinac did not serve a military purpose so much as a commercial one. The fort was a link within the French fur trading network on the Great Lakes. In the summer of 1715, the post of Michilimackinac was distressed through lack of provisions. An appeal was made to Dubuisson, commanding at Detroit, but he sent word that the corn supply had run so short he had sent Dupuy to the Miamis to try to buy of them, but it was doubtful if they could supply enough. In this extremity Ramezay appealed to John Caire, who went among his Iroquois friends in the villages of central New York and bought 300 minutes of corn, about 900 bushels. The Indians carried it some 20 leagues from the place of purchase to the shore of Lake Ontario. It was loaded into canoes for Captain des Chalons and dispatched to the distressed post, but all of this occasioned such delays that 100 Frenchmen and Canadian inhabitants were allowed to leave Mackinac and go to winter at Montreal. In 1716, the French court revoked all land deeds granted by Cadillac. 11. For the first 3 decades of the 18th century unto the day of his death there were endless complaints about John Caire and his activities. His usefulness to the French can be demonstrated from the trouble he made for the English and the Dutch traders at Albany, and the Indians in English allegiance. He had tried to stir up the Senecas to kill and plunder all the far Indians that came to trade at Niagara or Lake Ontario. In December 1716, John Caire found the Seneca villages, in what is now western New York, ravaged by smallpox, which was taking a heavy toll from the Iroquois and the tribes to the south and west. One band of 300 warriors which set out to attack the Illinois returned because their chief had died of the disease. The English, which by this time had become predominant among the eastern Indians of the Federation, circulated evil rumors regarding John Caire, that he had been sent thither to amuse them whilst preparations were being made to march against them in the spring, and, even though he was highly esteemed among and even adopted by them, could not succeed in removing the suspicion of his Seneca friends, who were influenced that he had come among them as a spy. John Caire had spent the winter of 1716-17 in the Seneca's country, and when he went back to Montreal in the spring, a chief of high character was sent with him to learn from Vaudreuil if the French were preparing any steps hostile to the Senecas. Later, a delegation of chiefs and 40 others arrived and were given audience by Vaudreuil. They did not omit the usual request at these conferences that John Caire, the Longueuils, father and son, and de la Chauvennerie, should be allowed to go into their villages whenever they would wish to do so or should be invited. They added that they were fully aware the English would not be pleased, but they were the masters of their own country and wished their children, likewise, to be its masters and go thither freely whenever Vaudreuil should permit them. In July 1717, Sabrevois was recalled to Quebec and Alphonse de Tonty was named commandant of Fort Pontchartrain. Tonty was personally responsible for all expenses at the fort, including salaries and clothing for the missionary, surgeon, soldiers and interpreters, presents for natives. He was to use the profits from trade to pay these expenses, but found himself with a debt he couldn't pay. His solution was to sell out the trade to 2 men, François Lamarck, his father-in-law, and Louis Gastineau, which took on 3 partners of their own, Thierry, Nolan, and Gwyn. The fee they paid Tonty covered fort expenses and Tonty finished the work. Sabrevois has started. These new trade bosses weren't much better than Tonty, and while he was commandant, annual trade fairs which offered 20 or more stores in Cadillac's day, never grew above 2 stores, and those were owned by the Same person. Cadillac returned to France, with his son, arriving in Paris in September 1717, not long after returning to France, he was arrested and sent to the Bastille for speaking against John Law, who was petitioning French investors in establishing settlements along the Mississippi River. Officially charged with the suspicion of speaking treasonous words, Cadillac and his son spent 6 months in the prison, but was never tried. Within a couple of years, his warnings against Law proved to be well-founded. 39. Cadillac's son was jailed because he was with his father when on an expedition to Illinois lands, in 1715, and had reported to the king that they had discovered vast mineral deposits. After release in early 1718, Cadillac re-established ties with his allies in the Ministry of Marine and petitioned the court for compensation of land he claimed to have cleared in Detroit, and returned with his family to St. Nicolas de la Grave. 12. In June, Alphonse de Tonty left Montreal for Detroit, at which post he had been granted the privilege of trade on condition that he would confine his operations to the jurisdiction of Detroit nor send goods for sale to distant tribes. In crossing Lake Ontario, on his way to Niagara, he met 9 canoes all going to trade at Albany, 3 were from Mackinac, 3 from Detroit and 3 from Saginaw. Tonty endeavored to head off this prospective trade for the English, and succeeded so well, heightening his arguments by substantial presents of brandy, so that they all agreed not to go to Albany but to go with him to Detroit. 2 days later, when this imposing flotilla was within 6 miles of Niagara, they fell in with 17 canoes, full of Indians and peltries going to Albany to trade. Tonty, inspired by self-interest, induced them also to abandon their design by the promise of brandy. There followed a judicious distribution of this potent commodity. 26 laden canoes which had traveled long journeys from remote and widely separated points, their one objective point was the English trading place on the Hudson, but no sooner do they come under the aroma of brandy kegs than long-cherished plans are thrown to the winds. They beached their canoes near the point of Niagara and a cask of liquor was broached, and Tonty permitted the thirsty savages to buy 2 or 3 quarts of brandy each to take to their villages. After distribution of brandy all re-embarked, Tonty sent interpreter Loranger with 7 of the canoes which had promised to go to Montreal, to keep them from changing their minds as they paddled down the lake. He was only able to conduct 6 of them to Montreal, though, as the 7th escaped and went to Orange. Meanwhile, 10 canoes joined the retinue, all paddled swiftly up the Niagara to the old landing, made the toilsome portage around the falls and pushed on to Detroit, where they arrived July 3. This expedition was notable for its use of the Niagara route. Only a few years before a band of Oghjagere, Outapamis, otherwise Foxes or Sars, led by Voncray lay in wait at the Niagara portage, so that an expedition for Detroit led by Vincennes was sent by the Ottawa River route, not only to avoid these savages, but to prevent being pillaged by the Iroquois. 13. In April of 1720, Mendard Schuyler and Robert Livingston Jr. set out from Albany for the Seneca Castles to hold conference with the Indians because the French are now besieged at Oghjagere, which ought not to be consented to or admitted. The English emissaries went on to remind their Seneca brethren of the promises that had been made about 22 years ago to secure their lands and hunting places westward of them, to the crown of Great Britain to be held for you and your posterity. The French are now besieged at Oghjagere, which in a manner is the only gate you have to go through towards your hunting places and the only way the far Indians conveniently came through, where Jean C's John Cayer with some men are now at work on building a blockhouse and no doubt of a garrison by the next year, whereby you will be so infenced that no room will be left for you to hunt in without liberty. We know that in wartime they could never overcome you, but these proceedings in building so near may be their invented intrigues to hush you to sleep whilst they take possession of the heart of your country. This is plainly seen by us, therefore desire you to consider it rightly and send out to spy what they are doing at Oghjagere and prohibit Jean Kerr building there, for where they make settlements they endeavor to hold it, so that if he takes no notice thereof, after given in a civil way, further complaints may be made to your brother Corlaer, who will endeavor to make you easy therein. According to custom, the gift of a belt of wampum was presented to the sachems and they retired to deliver it, and, 6 days later, on May 22, the sachems of the Seneca, Cayuga, and Oneida, on behalf of their own peoples and of the Mohawk and Onondaga, spoke at length to the English delegates with customary grandiloquence regarding the French intrusion at Niagara. 3 chiefs were appointed to go to Niagara to expostulate with the French, and Schuyler and Livingston deputed their Dutch interpreter, Lawrence Clayson, go with them. Meanwhile, John Cayer/Senencas had been so long busy with plans for giving the French a foothold on the Niagara Passage as a means of reaching the upper posts that even his Seneca friends had increasing cause to regard him with suspicion. This was a location of great strategic importance, for it commanded the portage around the falls, which was used by a great number of Western Indians when they traveled towards the English and French settlements for purposes of trade. When Vaudreuil learned that the English were planning to occupy it, he sent John Cayer to the Senecas with instructions to gain their ascent to a French post. The Niagara portage is 2.5 leagues to 3 leagues long, but the road, over which carts roll 2 or 3 times a year, is very fine, with very beautiful and open woods through which a person is visible for a distance of 600 paces. The trees are all oaks, and very large. The soil along the entire length of that road is not very good. From the landing, which is 3 leagues up the river, 4 hills are to be ascended. Above the first hill there is a Seneca village of about 10 cabins, where Indian corn, beans, peas, watermelons, and pumpkins are raised, all which are very fine. These Senecas are employed by the French, from whom they earn money by carrying the goods of those who are going to the upper country, some for matasses. 40. Others for shirts, some for powder and ball, whilst some others pilfer, and on the return of the French, they carry their packs of furs for some peltry. This portage is made for the purpose of avoiding the cataract of Niagara, the grandest sheet of water in the world, having a perpendicular fall of 200 or 300 feet. This fall is the outlet of Lakes Erie, Huron, Michigan, Superior, and consequently of the numberless rivers discharging into these lakes, with the names of which I am not acquainted. The Niagara portage having been passed, we ascend a river 6 leagues in length and more than 1/4 of a league in width, in order to enter Lake Erie, which is not very wide at its mouth. The southern route is much finer than that along the northern shore. The reason that few persons take it is that it is 30 leagues longer than that along the north. There is no need of fasting, as on either side of this lake deer are to be found there in such great abundance. Buffaloes are found on the south, but not on the north shore. 41. The previous year, at the beginning of harvest, John Cayer had laden his canoe with trinkets and small merchandises of powder and lead, not forgetting the useful belts of wampum and the equally important brandy, and he crossed over to the Longhouse of the Iroquois, wintering in the heart of New York State, part of the time at the Great Seneca Village and part of the time at the little village of White Springs, 1½ miles southwest of Geneva. This village was later removed to it. Location some 2 miles northwest of Geneva, where it was long famous as the Gianunda Saga of the Senecas, otherwise Canadjun Saga. The Seneca castle called Onahe was at this period about 3 miles southeast from the present village of Canandaigua. The Senecas were most favorably disposed towards their father Onontio and to their uncle Senencas, by which name they had come affectionately to designate John Cayer, as they were masters of their land. Early in May 1720, Senencas presented him at their settlements and convened an assembly of the chiefs. When they had gathered, he informed them that he had always derived much pleasure from his visits among them and would come even more frequently if he had a house of his own to which he could withdraw. The chiefs replied that as one of their sons he was free to build a house for himself wherever he chose. John Cayer hurried to Fort Frontenac. The winter had been well spent. He brought with him not merely several bundles of peltries but good tidings that the natives had consented to the building of a house, trading post. No time was lost. A canoe was packed with goods, some pieces of blue cloth, 3 dozen or thereabouts of white blankets for the use of the Indians, half a barrel of brandy and sea, and with 8 soldiers and young Lockhorn, son of Captain de Lockhorn, mayor of Montreal, the expedition set out. The season was propitious, the voyage short and successful. Entering the mouth of the Niagara, they pressed on upriver to the head of navigation. Here, at the beginning of the portage on the east side of the gorge, where Lewiston now stands, Jonkheyer and Lockhorn built in haste a cabin of bark which was surrounded by a strong, high palisades of sharpened stakes, where they displayed the king's colors and honored it with the name of La Magazine Royal, the king's store, for trade with the Mississaugas distant about 30 leagues from Niagara. 42. The Indians not only consented to the building of the House of Niagara but also engaged to maintain it, and if the English should undertake to demolish it they must first take up the hatchet against the cabanes of the 2 villages of the Senecas. 13. The work on the bark house under the Niagara escarpment was no sooner begun than word of it was carried eastward through the lodges and villages of the 6 nations. On the last day of May in the spring of 1720, after a week of travel from the Seneca town, Lawrence Clayson and the 3 Seneca chiefs arrived at Magazine Royal and found it a good-sized house, 40 foot long and 30 wide, but not ample enough to afford them a hospitable reception. It was occupied by a French merchant and 2 other Frenchmen, one of them Duville. Jonkheyer does not appear to have been there when Clayson arrived. Clayson wanted to demolish Magazine Royal but Lockhorn did not permit them to do so, and Lockhorn, without an order from Jonkheyer, on being advised thereof by an Indian, went to the Senecas to prevent them consenting to that demolition. Clayson and Lockhorn argued. Clayson claimed to have been sent with the sachems to tell you that the 5 nations have heard you are building a house at Oghjagere, Niagara, and have considered how prejudicial a French settlement on their land must consequently prove to them and their posterity, if not timely prevented. Wherefore they have sent me and them to acquaint you with their resolution that it is much against their inclination that any buildings should be made here, and that they desire you to desist further building and to leave and demolish what you have made. The French merchant was at no loss for defense and replied that Onontio, the governor of Canada, had posted him at Oghjagere to trade and he would not demolish Magazine Royal until Onontio ordered it. Returning by way of Irondequoit, Clayson encountered new evidence of French enterprise, a blacksmith whom the governor of Canada had sent among the Senecas in 3 French canoes loaded with goods bound up for Niagara. By June 7, Clayson was back at the Seneca castles, where he called together the chiefs and young warriors for a council. When they met, Jonkheyer appeared with them. Clayson told the assembly what had been said at Niagara, whereupon the Indians, old sachems, and young warriors alike, joined in suggesting that the English at Albany write to their father Onontio and insist that the house be destroyed. Here Jonkheyer, whom was listening, now interrupted Clayson, exclaiming, "You seek to have the house at Niagara torn down only because you are afraid that you traders at Albany will not get any trade from the Seneca nation and from the Indians of the far west. When we keep our house and people at Niagara we can stop the Senecas and the western Indians too from trading with you. That is the trouble with you. You are not afraid that we keep the land from the Senecas." Clayson disputed that the French had made the settlement at Niagara only to encroach on the 5 nations, to hinder them in their hunting, and to debar them from the advantage they should reap by permitting a free passage of the western Indians. And charged the French with imposing on these people in trade, selling them goods at exorbitant rates. For a blanket of Strouds you demand 8 beavers, for a white blanket 6, and other goods in proportion, whereas they may have them at Albany for half those prices. And the assembled Indians gravely affirmed that it was so. Lawrence Clayson went back to Albany, leaving Jonkheyer for the time victorious. For the Seneca, this occurrence was but another step towards an inevitable end. For the French, it was a great achievement. The adroit Jonkheyer had crowned the efforts of more than 40 years, for ever since La Salle had built his first house on the river the French had longed for its permanent possession. Jonkheyer went to confirm his peace with the Seneca at Fort Frontenac, leaving Lockhorn in command at the Seneca's village, and taking John Durant the chaplain of the fort into his canoe, they voyaged together to Quebec. Arriving thereat on September 3, Jonkheyer was granted audience with Vaudreuil, whom was so pleased that he bestowed the title of commandant at Niagara upon Jonkheyer the next day and bade him hasten back to that precarious post. A little after that of Niagara, a new post was established at the foot of the Bay of Cant by Sieur de Anville. 43. 14. About the middle of October 1720, Joncaire set out from Montreal to winter at Niagara. His 2 canoes were laden deep with goods from the king's storehouse, and his escort numbered 12 soldiers, and at Fort Frontenac 6 were left behind. There were delays at Frontenac and beyond. As he skirted the south shore of Ontario, his journey was stopped by ice 35 leagues from the Niagara, so he wintered at the Genesee Valley, and the expected relief at the mouth of the Niagara Gorge never came to the cabin of bark. D'Youville had stayed there alone with 1 soldier waiting Joncaire. It was, probably, the friendship of the Senecas which preserved them, but Joncaire's failure to arrive in the fall with goods to trade kept the storehouse empty till spring, to the embarrassment of the French and disappointment of the Indians. Tonty continued to upset French Canadians at Detroit, and the trade business declined enough that community and tribal leaders filed complaints. Tonty was called to Quebec to answer these complaints in the winter of 1721-22, and François-Marie Picotte, Sieur de Belestre, son of François-Marie Picotte and Marie-Catherine Trottier, maintained the fort in his absence. The English had proposed to an Iroquois chief settled at Niagara that they would send horses thither from Orange, which is 130 leagues distant from it, for the purpose of transmitting goods, and to make a permanent settlement there, and offered to share with whatever profits might accrue from the speculation. The English would, by such means, have been able to secure the greatest part of the peltries coming down the lakes from the upper countries, give employment not only to the Indians who go up there and return thence, but also to the French. The French had a well-supplied store there with goods for trade, and had carried on there a considerable barter trade in furs for merchandise and whiskey for several years. This establishment enabled them to purchase the greater part of the peltries both of the French and Indians belonging to the upper country, and they were about to attempt an establishment on the Niagara, had not the French forestalled them. Whenever the Indians went to Albany to confer, it was customary for the sachem to make a speech and present gifts of wampum belts. Lawrence Clayson was usually summoned to interpret communications made through successive interpretations. Of all the white men present, Clayson alone understood the 5 nations' dialects, more or less accurately, and interpreted in Dutch, and Robert Livingston, secretary for the Indian commissioners, knowing both Dutch and English but not Indian, translated what Clayson had said for Governor Burnet, whom understood only English. No other interpreter seems to have borne so important a part in speech-making as Lawrence Clayson, yet, Clayson's knowledge failed him at Albany, in 1722, when interpreting between the Delawares and Governor Spotswood of Virginia, so James Laddard, another interpreter, was called in to convert Delaware into Mohawk or Dutch. And again, at Albany, in 1723, Clayson could not understand representatives of the far western tribes, but a Seneca who had been a prisoner among them could, and interpreted to Clayson, who in turn interpreted to the commissioners of Indian Affairs. There were other interpreters employed by the English at this period, among them Captain Johannes Bleecker and Jan Baptist van Epps, who was sent on important missions among the Senecas. His name in some reports of Indian speeches appears as John the Baptist. In 1726 he was witness to a trust deed by which the Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas confirmed to Governor Burnet as representative of King George, the quitclaim deed which the 5 nations had executed in 1701, 4 lands from the Salmon River, in Oswego County, New York, to Cleveland, Ohio, a strip 60 miles wide back into the country from the waterfront, including all along Lake Erie and the narrow passage to the falls of Oghjagere called Cahockwarrig and the river of Oghjagere, the lake Cadaraquis, and c. It is no small wonder the English vigorously contested all French establishments on the Niagara. 2 years after the signing of this deed, Clayson was invited to Oswego to mark out a land grant for the king. As late as November 23, 1730, he was returning to Albany from Onondaga and reporting to the Indian commissioners the latest news regarding Joncaire/Senencas. In 1723 Joncaire again demonstrated his great influence over the Iroquois by obtaining their permission to replace the original trading house by a wooden stockade large enough to hold 300 defenders. In 1731, he was chosen by Governor Charles de Beauharnois de la Boisque to command a group of Shawnees who had migrated from the Susquehanna to the Allegheny River. His mission was to prevent them from trading with the English and if possible to induce them to move their village farther west, preferably to Detroit, where French influence was greater. Joncaire was apparently working at this task when he died at Fort Niagara on June 29, 1739. Courageous and arrogant, ruthless and unscrupulous, hated and feared by the English whose intrigues and designs he so frequently uncovered and disrupted, admired by the Iroquois who considered him one of their own, Joncaire was a mighty agent of French influence among the Indians for over 40 years. It was with men like him that France built her wilderness empire in America. 44. 15. Cadillac had given certain rights to François Lamarck, one of the men to whom Tonty sold the trading business, but Tonty did not honor these rights, and thus Lamarck filed a complaint with officials at Quebec. In 1724, Tonty was called to Quebec to answer to these new charges. With Fort Niagara being completed in 1726 and dominating the mouth of the Niagara, the French had plans for another fort at the Lake Erie entrance to the river. Under the orders of the governor of Nouvelle-France, the first white settler to build at the natural junction of east-west transportation routes from the Hudson-Mohawk River valleys to the Great Lakes Basin, what is now the city of Buffalo, visited by early French trappers and Jesuit missionaries, was Chabert Joncaire, whom had established a trading post at Lewiston. In 1727, Tonty went to Quebec to welcome Marquis de Beauharnois, the new governor of Nouvelle-France, whom he asked for help in making improvements to Fort Pontchartrain, but Hurons whom had settled near the fort were threatening to leave if Tonty wasn't replaced. Tonty was relieved of command in early spring of 1728, but he died before that date on November 10, 1727. Jean-Baptiste de Strs, Sieur de Caillan's 45. Was named as Tonty's replacement, and he improved conditions at the fort. Fort Pontchartrain, which had dwindled to about 30 families, saw new settlers, including Robert Navarre, come from Acadia, Nova Scotia, which was ceded to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, following the War of the Spanish Succession, 1702–1713. Trade was finally made free as a result of the constant displeasure with commandant-controlled trade. An active military man at heart, Caillan's didn't keep the post long. In the spring of 1729, he gave up the job in hopes of a military promotion. In 1730, Louis-Henri Deschamps, Sieur de Boisébert, 46, became the 6th official commandant of Fort Pontchartrain. He was only at the post for 3 years, but improved conditions there quite a bit. In 1733, Yves Jacques Huguespien, Sieur de Livandière, 47, became the 7th official commandant at Fort Pontchartrain. The garrison, at that time, had only 17 soldiers. By 1734, things started looking up for the settlement. The court finally saw fit to appoint a royal notary at Fort Pontchartrain. Previously, only the priest at Ste-Anne's kept village records. The court appointed Robert Navarre, 48. He held various positions in the settlement, including justice, surveyor, and collector, through French and part of British rule. In 1731, Governor Charles de Beauharnois de la Boisque sent Louis-Thomas Chabert de Joncaire to control a party of Shawnees who had moved to Susquehanna River in Allegheny. He was to prevent them from dealing with the British and to convince them to return to Detroit, where French influence is predominant. In 1735, Pien reported a successful wheat crop at Fort Pontchartrain. Some was exported to Europe. Pien's reports were paramount in Quebec's decisions to later increase the garrison to 60 men and to strengthen the fort. Philippe Thomas Joubert de Joncaire. Philippe Thomas Joubert de Joncaire. 49. Aged 28, succeeded his father as chief among the Iroquois, in 1735, whose purpose was to win them over to the French cause with gifts, and, as such, he was hostage, trader, interpreter, and principal political agent for Nouvelle France in the western wilderness. He supplied the European trade goods on which the indigenous peoples had become dependent. He was obliged to pacify the Iroquois when the French or their native allies did something disquieting, and to mollify the French when young warriors, contrary to tribal policy, committed an aggression. He was so effective at this that the British, in 1744, put price on his head dead or alive. Sieur de Joubert, a Frenchman of illustrious lineage who known as Senanquis by the Seneca which adopted him as one of their own, was called Joncaire to distinguish him from his son, and the son was known as Joubert Joncaire. Because the Senecas only inherited from the mother, the younger Joubert was regarded by the Senecas as an Seneca, and not as a Frenchman. He was known as Nita-Chinon by the Iroquois. Jesuits, though, considered unions between the French and French métis or savage, unbaptized, women as pagan, and the children were considered bastards. Many Jesuit would not even marry or baptize the children of such unions, often referring to les sauvages country wives as slaves. The Jesuits did not consider a marriage between two people and God as celebrated by the community as a valid union. They, however, did accept a baptism by a non-priest, especially if the parties involved were influential. Joncaire had come to the Niagara region in the early days of the French influence among the Seneca, and he played a most important part in establishing French control of the Niagara, despite vehement British protests and risking the loss of the lucrative trade network with Albany. The Seneca had given the French permission to construct a fortified trading house, in the early 1720s, on the site of future Fort Niagara, near Youngstown, New York. The trading house at Niagara was among the last real efforts by the French to retain some semblance of activity within the western fur trade, which was increasingly dominated by the British in Albany. Though their efforts ultimately proved fruitless, the military and trade situations in Nouvelle France would have been markedly worse if not for the efforts of Joncaire. Joubert Joncaire had even greater influence over the Indians than his father, and through his relationship with the Seneca he made it possible for the French to build Fort Niagara when permission to do so had previously been refused both the French and the English. In 1736, Nicolas Joseph de Noailles, 50, was appointed commandant of Fort Pontchartrain by Governor Beauharnois. On May 6, 1736, he left Montreal for Fort Pontchartrain. In the meantime, the king, who had rejected Noailles' commission, neither Noailles nor Governor Beauharnois knew this at the time, had awarded the position to Pierre-Jacques Payen de Noyen, Sieur de Charvis, Chavois. 51. Charvis was recovering from surgery, or waiting to have surgery, and had not yet left for Fort Pontchartrain. The villagers really liked Noailles, so Beauharnois never told him of the king's rejection, and he maintained the post for a full 3 years. Pierre-Jacques Payen de Noyen, Sieur de Charvis finally took command in 1739, though, not much is known about his 3-year term at Fort Pontchartrain. On June 29, 1739, Joncaire, son of Antoine-Marie de Joncaire, Esquire, and Gabrielle Hardy, died at Fort Niagara. On July 6, 1742, Pierre-Joseph Celeron, Sieur de Blainville, 52, became the 9th official commandant at Fort Pontchartrain. His term as commandant ended in June of 1744. Paul-Joseph Lemoyne, 53, was appointed to succeed Celeron in 1744. Despite the fact that France declared war on Great Britain on March 15, 1744, life in the village was fairly quiet and pleasant until 1746, when Chief Mackinac led a group of Chippewa from the north in an attack on Fort Pontchartrain. Some Wyandots and Iroquois set aside their differences to join in the attack. The attack was unsuccessful, though, as Chief Pontiac. 54. Of the Ottawa fiercely drove out the attackers. The villagers were frightened into staying in or near the fort. Hostility towards indigenous peoples unfriendly to the French had to be maintained, and British initiatives, such as the summoning of one warrior from every village to Chouakin, Oswego, New York, in December 1743, required reporting to the governor. Some persuasion was needed to keep the Senecas supplying Fort Niagara with fresh game. The thrust of English traders like George Croghan. 55. Into the country between the upper Ohio River and the Great Lakes, about 1745, occasioned a realignment of some Indian groups in that area. Within a few years after arriving in British North America, Croghan became one of Pennsylvania's leading fur traders, establishing trading posts in indigenous villages, like French traders did, rather than wait for his Aboriginal customers to come to him, which was the usual British practice. He also learned the Delaware and Mohawk languages. Croghan's primary business partner was trader William Trent, son of the founder of Trenton, New Jersey. Their partnership was temporarily suspended when Trent joined the military to serve in King George's War, 1744–48. The two men purchased property on Condensed Creek in Pennsboro Township, and Croghan built a plantation there, which served as his home and base of operations from about 1745 until 1751. Britain's blockade of French ports made the few French trade goods reaching Ohio country prohibitively expensive, a bonanza for the Pennsylvania traders that alarmed the French. Trade and diplomacy were closely linked among the natives, and Croghan's activities threatened French influence in the region. Croghan's first headquarters in the Ohio County was established at a Seneca village on the Cuyahoga River, present-day Cleveland, Ohio. As he expanded his trade westwards towards Detroit, French officials urged French allied Indians to attack him. In April 1745, Senecas protected Croghan from capture, but a canoe load of Croghan's furs were robbed by French allied natives, elsewhere, as had happened to William Johnson a few years earlier and French fur trader Louis Thomas Joncaire de Chabert decades before that. In 1746, the Iroquois appointed Croghan as a Seneca to their governing body, the Onondaga Council. Joncaire's son, Philippe Thomas, was Croghan's and Johnson's principal French opponent, but beginning in 1746 even Johnson and the Onondaga Council acquiesced to Croghan's dominant role in Ohio country affairs. In 1747, independent of the Iroquois Confederacy, the newly formed Ohio Confederation lit a council fire on the Ohio River, at Logstown. In early 1747, 5 French traders were murdered by Senecas and Wyandots at the Wyandot village of Sandusky on Lake Erie, beginning an Indian revolt against the French fomented by Croghan. It was first led by Wyandot chief Nicholas Orantony, then Memeskia, or Old Britain as Croghan named him, formerly La Demoiselle, a Piankashaw Miami chief. The uprising was unsuccessful in driving out the French, and the Indians involved moved closer to the British. Reports claimed that Croghan had encouraged the uprising so that the natives would trade with him and not the French. Old Britain relocated to Pickawillany on the Great Miami River, where Croghan built a stockade and trading post. Following the defection from the French alliance of the Huron chief Orantony, segments of his tribe, and of the Miami, moved from the borders of the lakes to the branches of the Ohio. Tanacrisson was one of 6 signers of a 1747 letter, in Croghan's handwriting, reporting a treaty between the pro-British Mingo and Shawnee and the Ainomi, Miami, nation. One of the other Mingo signers was Tanacrisson's closest associate, Scaroidy, an Oneida, who handled relations between the Iroquois and the Shawnees. The Iroquois Council at Onondaga, near Syracuse, New York, regarded the Mingo settlers of Ohio as warriors with no authority to hold formal councils. They had no recognized council fire and no designated speaker, or king. Pennsylvania's interest in trade and Virginia's interest in obtaining land for settlement encouraged direct dealings with the aboriginal peoples of Ohio rather than with the Onondaga Council, In April 1748, Croghan made a present goods to the Ohio natives on behalf of Pennsylvania, and, in September, Indian agent Johann Conrad Weiser delivered a larger present, to which Virginia also contributed, establishing Logstown, Ambridge, Pennsylvania, as a council place. At this same meeting, Tanachrison, 56, was identified as the half-king, a title of English origin. The French equivalent Le Demiraux appears only in translations, defining his role as spokesman for the Iroquois colonists on the Ohio. Tanachrison and his associates, as new beginners in council matters, requested a supply of wampum, which was one of the essential evidences of the validity of an aboriginal treaty. Tanachrison was the spokesman at a conference held at Logstown by Croghan in May 1751, and at another in June 1752, when Virginia sought ratification of a land cession. In 1748, Le Moyne's term as commandant at Fort Pontchartrain ended, but he remained as second in command. It is not clear who was commandant from 1748 to 1750. In 1748, his wife having died 2 years earlier, Philippe Thomas Chabert de Joncaire resigned from his post pleading ill health. He was succeeded by his brother Daniel. He may have wished to stay in Montreal to look after their 3 young children, but was soon recalled to the frontier. The following year, Pierre-Joseph Céloron de Blainville hired him as advisor and interpreter for an expedition to the Ohio Valley. Sent ahead to establish first contact with the Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo, Joncaire narrowly escaped death when he was seized at Soniato, later Portsmouth, Ohio, by some Shawnee which feared the French had come to destroy them and were going to execute him. He was saved from execution through the intervention of one of his brother Iroquois present at his capture. When Céloron's forces withdrew in the autumn, Chabert Joncaire accompanied them. By 1750, the French built Fort Niagara, Fort du Portage, on the Niagara River, and another about 1.5 miles above Niagara Falls, to protect the valuable portage that ran between the 2 points. The fort included 3 wooden blockhouses, with palisades and ditches between the buildings and the river. A settlement was established on Buffalo Creek in 1758. 57 Chabert Joncaire reported that he built a shed 100 feet long, of pine, a barn, 100 feet, with cedar timbers, a stable, a dwelling, 45 feet, a shop, 20 feet, for the blacksmith, a storehouse 25 feet long, a second barn nearly finished. Horses were used to plow and till the fields. Corn, tobacco, and hay were cultivated within an area of 1/2 mile by 3/4 of a mile. In 1750, Pierre-Joseph Céloron, Sieur de Blainville, once again commandant of Fort Pontchartrain and governor of Canada, offered incentives for people to settle at the post. Each family was promised a farm, military stores, tools, and agricultural supplies. At least 54 heads of households came to take advantage of the offer, which proved to be a disappointment. The tools were not gifts, but loans that were to be repaid once the family was settled. Many of the new settlers were young, single men, not families. A shortage of single females prompted Céloron to request that single women be sent from Canada. Céloron left the post of commandant in 1754, at which time Jacques-Pierre Desnaux, Sieur de Mouy 58 took over, and held the post until his death in 1758. Jean-Baptiste Henry Béranger assumed command of Fort Pontchartrain after Desnaux's death until later in the year, when François-Marie Picot de Belestre 59 took command. His father is often listed as a commandant of Fort Pontchartrain. He became the 13th official commandant of Fort Pontchartrain and was the last to command under French rule. In 1750, Chabert Joncaire returned to the area and was stationed at Chiningui, Logstown, now Ambridge, PA, with 12 soldiers to prepare for the arrival of Paul Marin de la Malgue, whom intended to build a series of forts linking Lake Erie and Ohio. Chabert Joncaire remained in charge of Indian relations and undertook to interest the natives of the region to deal with the French, in preparation He reported that all the natives favored the traders from Pennsylvania and Virginia whom had ventured into the region, but with bribes, threats, and promises he struggled to win them over. The threats were quite accurate, the tribes agreeing to trade with Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the English, would simply be destroyed. Persuaded that British friendship and protection assured the greatest benefits to the Ohio natives, Tannacrisson sought to unite the tribes in opposition to French military occupation of the Upper Ohio. Not all of them agreed with him. When Paul Marin de la Malgue arrived in 1753, many Delaware and Shawnee were overawed by the large French force and, perhaps willing to see Iroquois influence in the area challenged, proclaimed them in favor of his presence. Oghjagere was in charge of the delicate diplomacy required to maintain the goodwill of the Delaware and Shawnee and to neutralize the opposition of the half-king Tannacrisson, spokesman for the Iroquois colonists settled on the Upper Ohio River, from about 1748, who were protesting against the construction of forts. The Delawares made a rather mild protest. Scaroidy, too, protested, in the name of the Shawnees, and, on September 3, Tannacrisson also made demands that the French withdraw, but was rejected by French commander, Paul Marin de la Malgue. Acting not for the Iroquois Council but for the warriors on the Ohio, Tannacrisson and Scaroidy traveled to Winchester with a delegation of Iroquois, Delaware, Shawnee, Huron, and Miami, in response to a Virginian invitation, and then went to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to seek support. Emboldened perhaps by Marin's death, Tannacrisson advised the English traders to leave Ohio. However, he and two other chiefs, Jessica Cake and Coxswacktanniont, accompanied Major George Washington on his trip to Fort de la Riviere au Boeuf, Waterford, Pennsylvania, with Virginia's demand that the French depart. Rebuffed again, Tannacrisson returned to Logstown on January 15, 1754, escorted by a French detachment under Michel Marais de la Chauvennerie, who set up a temporary post nearby. In the following month Tannacrisson joined some Virginians in erecting a fort, at the site of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and aided them until they surrendered on April 18 to Claude-Pierre Picaud de Contrecoeur, who proceeded to build Fort Duquesne there. A Virginia detachment under Washington was dispatched to reassert English authority in the region and, joined by Tannacrisson, on May 28, attacked a party of French, near present Jumonville, Pennsylvania. The leader of the French, Joseph Coulon de Villers de Jumonville, was killed by Tannacrisson. Washington withdrew a few miles to the Great Meadows, near Farmington, Pennsylvania, and hastily built Fort Necessity in anticipation of French retaliation. On June 1, Tannacrisson and some 80 to 100 Mingos left before he surrendered on July 4 to a French siege. They made their way first to the site of Cumberland, Maryland, and then to Awick, Shirleysburg, Pennsylvania, where Croghan had his trading post. Delaware and Shawnee leaders were summoned and Tannacrisson went to John Harris's post to bring Conrad Weiser back to Awick for a council, which occurred from 4 to 6 September 1754, and was aimed at securing the Delaware and Shawnee in the English interest. The attempt failed, though, as these Indians could not leave the Ohio, and Pennsylvania could not protect them there. Most of the refugee Iroquois remained at Awick. About the end of the month, however, Scaroidy brought the half-king and his family, in poor health, to Harris's post, where Tannacrisson died on October 4, 1754. 60 Virginia and Pennsylvania promptly recognized Scaroidy, died in June 1757 at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as the new half-king, but his journeys to New York to seek help from the Superintendent of Northern Indians, Sir William Johnson, left the actual leadership of the group unsettled and, as late as January 1756, a matter of dispute. Replaced at Venango by Michel Marais de la Chauvennerie, Oghjagere returned to Niagara in the summer of 1755. Governor Vaudreuil was anxious to learn the sentiments of the Iroquois. 4 separate enemy armies approached the borders of Nouvelle France, and Oghjagere acted as a runner between villages, though he dared not visit the Onondaga, Tuscarora, or Oneida for fear of British ambush. From his post amongst the Seneca, Chobert-Joncaire could learn of developments among all the Iroquois and promulgate French policy, calling on them to supply and aid French war parties or, failing that, to strictly observe the neutrality they had officially prescribed for themselves, and he warned that if any of them were to heed British Superintendent of Indian Affairs Sir William Johnson, and side with the enemy, their villages would be laid waste by the nations of the Pays d'Enhaut. In 1755, Robert Rogers 61 was commissioned to form and train a group of rangers consisting of 35 volunteers, 15 Royal Americans, a New England military group, and 6 men selected by Rogers. The group became known as Rogers Rangers, and Rogers became known as the New England Ranger. The destruction of Chouagan by Montcalm and the taking of Fort William Henry, in 1756, gave great weight to the earlier threats of Chobert-Joncaire, but, with the capture of Fort Frontenac, Kingston, by John Bradstreet, in August of that year, British power began to be perceived by the natives. The natives saw bad signs for the French cause, and some Seneca had asked the British to send them a gunsmith, a person in a position of great political influence. Joncaire's network of informants failed to give the alarm that might have saved Fort Frontenac, although, in February 1757, at Niagara, 60 warriors sang the war song, and, by April, Chobert-Joncaire was paying them for 38 British scalps. In June 1759, a Mohawk war party, traditional friends of the English, ventured into Seneca country and surprised Joncaire in his trading post. A leap through a window saved his life, but his son-in-law, Michel Lefebvre, Honor du Bois de la Militaire, was taken prisoner and another companion killed. Joncaire retreated to Niagara, but, in July when the fort fell, he was captured by Mohawks and taken into the New York area. He was befriended by them and lived amongst them until he was traded with a group of prisoners, for adoption or torture. He went to France, where he was made a Knight of the Order of St. Louis. Whether he ever returned to Canada is uncertain. He died before November 9, 1766. The British attacked Quebec and Montreal, and took the siege west. British garrisons in the western posts were made permanent when Montreal capitulated in 1760. In July 1759, Fort Niagara fell to the British. During the British siege of Fort Niagara, the French set fire to the fort to prevent its reuse by the attackers. The French surrendered New France. In 1760, General Geoffrey Amherst ordered British Major Robert Rogers to take Fort Pontchartrain. On November 29, 1760, in pursuance with the Articles of Capitulation, Rogers took command of Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, ending French rule in Detroit forever. Rogers' Rangers were cunning and successful and celebrated many victories, experiencing few casualties. This success gained Rogers a promotion to Major. Rogers left Detroit for Fort Pitt, on December 23, 1760, where he joined General Grant's siege against the Cherokees. In 1760, the British had built another fort near the site of the burnt-out Fort Pontchartrain and named it Fort Schlosser. Seneca Indians under British protection settled the area in 1780, and Joncaire's project at Buffalo was abandoned until the Holland Land Company opened up this region for settlement in 1799. A town was laid out in 1803-04. Michel Lefebvre, Honor du Bois de la Militaire. Michel Lefebvre, Honor du Bois de la Militaire was well established in the New York area, although, officially, a Mohawk hostage. In 1769, his 7-year-old son Pierre Lefebvre was living with his uncle Honor du Bois, age 42. La Militaire never saw his wife, Gabrielle Joncaire, again, for she died in France, before 1772. Pierre was raised by his uncle amongst the New England settlers and Mohawks. He spoke English and French in addition to the Iroquois language. Over the years, Michel Lefebvre, Honor du Bois de la Militaire established important relationships in the New York society. One of his friends was Captain James Delancey 62, grandfather of Stephen Delancey, eldest son of James. As many British soldiers of the time, Captain James Delancey was a Freemason. This was the first link between the Honor du Bois Militaire and Captain James Delancey. Both, Honor and James, were reluctant to the revolution for American independence brewing in New England, even though it was organized by prominent members of Freemasonry. Delancey secretly sold his properties preceding the fast-approaching break with England. This separation occurred on April 19, 1775 at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. When Michel Lefebvre, Honor du Bois de la Militaire, was killed during the American Revolution in early 1778, his properties were seized by the rebels. Pierre Lefebvre, then aged 15, was recovered by his friends Mohawk and brought to live with them, but, a few months later, he was rescued by Sir John Johnson, son of the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson. The attack on Detroit. Pontiac wanted to end the rule of the white man. He planned to bring all tribes within a 200,000 square mile area together to form an army to defeat the British and take back tribal lands. He formulated the plan at a Grand Council in April 1763 to be carried out the next month, in May of 1763. Pontiac and 60 other chiefs would wage a simultaneous attack against Fort Detroit, as well as forts at Green Bay, Mackinac, Sandusky, and St. Joseph. Pontiac himself led the attack on Fort Detroit by setting up a camp on the farm of Jean-Baptiste Meloki on the northeast coast of Detroit at the creek now called Bloody Run, where he operated a grist mill. On May 8, 1763, Pontiac and his warriors and chiefs requested and gained entrance to the council house through the east gate of the fort. These men all had blankets draped over their shoulders, hiding sawed-off shotguns. Pontiac had a wampum belt that he was to present to Major Gladwin, commandant of Fort Detroit, as a bogus gesture of friendship and goodwill. The actual handing over of the belt was to communicate whether or not the attack should go forward. If Pontiac offered the belt facing one way, the men were to attack. If the belt faced the other way, they were not to attack. Gladwin had been warned of the attack and was thus prepared. Before Pontiac and his men had a chance to reveal their weapons, Gladwin's soldiers revealed their weapons and Pontiac feigned offense, claiming that he was there in peace. 2 days later, Pontiac tried to enter the fort again, and when he was denied entrance, he and his men began a brutal assault against the British which lasted 153 days. The natives destroyed the houses on Belle Isle and murdered James Fisher and his family. Among other alleged murder victims was Sir Robert Davers and a survey team he was leading, a widow and her 2 children, and former Commandant, Donald Campbell, who had gone to try to negotiate a peace with Pontiac. Gladwin closed the fort and made plans for their defense. He sent men out to burn houses and other structures so that they would have a clear view and to eliminate possible cover. The French population outside the stockade was divided, with some helping the natives and others helping to get supplies into the stockade. Pontiac and his forces kept watch on the fort and killed anyone found outside attempting to procure supplies. As a sort of psychological warfare, bodies of these victims were often scalped and mutilated, then put on display. On May 28, Lieutenant Abraham Coiler of the Queen's Rangers stopped at Point Pelee to camp overnight. They were on their way to Detroit with supplies from Niagara and unaware of the attack, an easy target for a faction of Pontiac's men. Nearly half of the 96 members of Coiler's party escaped in boats, but 50 men were taken prisoner. 2 days later, the natives sailed toward their camp with the captives. When they were in the vicinity of the fort, 4 of the soldiers attacked their captors and swam toward shore with some of the supplies. The remaining soldiers were taken to Pontiac's fort where they, along with other captives already at the camp, were murdered. Their mutilated bodies were floated downstream on logs for the settlers to see. On July 29, a supply convoy of 260 men from the 60th Foot Regiment led by Captain Dalzell and Major Robert Rogers and his Rangers made safely it up the river to Fort Detroit. Upon arrival, Dalzell convinced Major Gladwin to allow him to mount an offensive against Pontiac. Gladwin reluctantly agreed, and on July 30, Dalzell and 250 soldiers and rangers headed out toward Pontiac's camp. The road to the camp was peppered with Pontiac's lookouts, as well as French sympathizers, and Pontiac was well aware of the advance long before the soldiers arrived. When the first of Dalzell's men crossed a small footbridge over Parent's Creek, warriors from Pontiac's army ambushed them. Dalzell was shot and the others turned back in confusion. Majors Rogers led some men to various buildings on the farm of Jacques Campeau and, from there, rescue teams were sent to retrieve any survivors. In all, only about 90 of the soldiers and rangers survived. Legend has it that so much blood was spilled into Parent Creek that it ran red, thus earning the name Bloody Run. The incident is hence known as the Battle of Bloody Run. No further excursions were made from the fort. The inhabitants received ample supplies from 2 vessels, Huron and Michigan. Pontiac tried to destroy the ships, as they interfered with his plans to starve the villagers, but he failed. Pontiac didn't let go of his determination to take Fort Detroit until October of 1763, when news peace treaty between the British and French had reached the village. The treaty meant that the French could no longer help the natives. As many of Pontiac's allies had gone back to their own territories and normal life by this time, his forces were depleted to the extent that there was no point in continuing. On October 31, 1763, Pontiac sent a message to Gladwin, asking for an agreement of peace. Gladwin forwarded the message to General Amherst, explaining to Pontiac that he lacked the authority to make such a peace. Pontiac and his people returned to their ancestral home on the Maumee River. Detroit was the only fort west of Niagara that wasn't destroyed. All the others, Green Bay, Mackinac, Sandusky, and St. Joseph, were captured and destroyed. While Pontiac sieged Detroit, his compatriots went after Fort Michilimackinac, starting a game of bagadowie, lacrosse, outside the fort. The plan was to accidentally knock the ball into the fort, and thus gain admittance to retrieve it. Captain Etherington, who would later become commandant at Detroit, and a Lieutenant Leslie stood by to watch the game. The plan was a success and all but 13 of the men in the garrison were killed. Etherington and Leslie were taken prisoner and eventually delivered to Montreal. On January 10, 1766, Major Rogers was made commandant of Michilimackinac, and he assumed command that August. While at Michilimackinac, Colonel Hopkins accused Rogers of planning to plunder the fort and desert to the French. Rogers was arrested, brought to trial in Montreal, and acquitted of the charge of treason. After his arrest, Rogers' wife divorced him. In 1775, Rogers wrote General George Washington offering his service to the revolutionaries. Many felt he was a British spy, and his offer was never accepted. In 1775 or 1776, Rogers was lieutenant colonel in the Queen's Rangers. His troop was captured at Mamaroneck, Long Island Sound, but Rogers escaped. In 1778, Rogers was banished from New Hampshire colony and returned to London, where he died in 1800. On July 23, 1767, Pontiac signed a peace treaty. In 1769, a Kaskaskian killed Pontiac by striking him in the back of the head with a hatchet. Compare the death of Louis Montour. The British deemed Fort Michilimackinac, a wooden structure, too vulnerable to attack, and in 1781 they built Fort Mackinac, a limestone fort on nearby Mackinac Island. The buildings were dismantled and moved piece by piece over water in the summer and ice in winter to the island over the course of 2 years. Patrick Sinclair, the lieutenant governor of Michilimackinac, ordered the remains of Fort Michilimackinac destroyed after the move. The name Jesuit was never acknowledged by founder St. Ignatius Loyola, but was first used by Jesuit adversaries in 1544 who scorned the members of the Society of Jesus for their overuse of the name Jesus. A second decree in 1679 prohibited the sale of alcohol outside of any French dwelling, and anyone caught transporting alcohol to any native village would suffer serious penalties, including tremendous fines and even prison terms. 3. The domaine du Roi was enlarged in 1658 and 1733. After the conquest of New France in 1763, it became the British King's domain and continued to operate in the same manner until 1860, when the lease of the Hudson's Bay Company, HBC, was terminated. 4. Educated by the Jesuits in France, Robert Cavalier de La Salle took orders and remained there until 1667. He then went to Canada, settled in Montreal and obtained a piece of land called China, later La Chine, because of its ambitions to reach China from the west. 5. In 1674, following an accident crossing the ice, Dollier was absent from Nouvelle-France to complete his convalescence. He returned to Montreal 4 years later and resumed his position as superior of the seminary, a position he held until his death. In addition, he helped the two women's communities, the Religious Hospitalières de St. Joseph and the Congregation of Notre Dame, to recover when they were victims of fires. 6. Pierre-Jacques Marquette, French missionary, was born on June 10, 1637 in Lyon, France, and he died on May 18, 1675 near the Marquette River, Michigan. He entered the Jesuits, Society of Jesus, at the age of 17, and was ordained priest in 1666 and assigned as a missionary to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He sailed for Nouvelle-France the same year and landed at Quebec on September 20, and on October 10 he went to Trois-Rivières, where he spent 18 months studying the Algonquin and Huron languages under Gabriel Druillettes. QV He showed great proficiency in learning 6 Aboriginal dialects, especially Huron. 7. Louis Joliet, brother of Adrien Joliet, was born on September 21, 1645 at Quebec. He attended the Jesuit College in Quebec but, in 1667, or 1668, left clergy life to become a trader. Much confusion surrounds the adventures of the Joliet brothers, and some sources attribute certain adventures to Louis, while others attribute the same to Adrian. Louis Joliet is most known for his explorations of the Mississippi River. 8. Sagamite is a Native American stew made from hominy or Indian corn. Additional ingredients include vegetables, wild rice, brown sugar, animal fat, beans, smoked fish or animal brains. Caddo sagamite was thick soup made from corn flour that had previously been parched and ground into a fine meal. Beans and acorn flour could be added. The Caddo served the stew in large earthenware pots, for crowds during ceremonies to celebrate welcomed guests by tribes such as the Peoria, Huron, Osage, and early Caddo tribes of Arkansas. 9. Daniel Graysolin, Sieur du Hut, called Duluth, was born about 1640 at St. Germain-en-Laye, between Saint-Étienne and Clermont-Ferrand, near Lyon, France, and he died at Montreal on February 26, 1710. He first served in the Company Lyonnaise, becoming a lieutenant in 1657, aged 21, and a gendarme of the Royal Guard in 1664, aged 28. He also took part in the campaign in Flanders and was present at the Great Battle of Fate, called Senef, in Belgium in 1674. This battle pitted 50,000 French led by the Prince Condé against a coalition of 60,000 led by the Prince of Orange, which had no winner but left between 14,000 and 28,000, according to different sources, for dead on the battlefield. Sometime after this battle he sailed for Quebec, whither he had been preceded by several members of his family, amongst them his cousins, the Tontis. Duluth at first settled in Montreal but, in September 1678, left for the west, being accompanied by his brother, La Tourette, 2 other soldiers and 3 slaves. 10. Michel Eco, a prominent coureur de bois, married the daughter of the chieftain of the Kaskaskias tribe and became a chieftain himself. 11. Jacques-René de Brissy de Denonville, Marquis de Denonville, Colonel and Brigadier of the Queen's Dragoons, Inspector General of Dragoons, Governor-General of Nouvelle-France, 1685–89, Major General, Deputy Governor for the Dukes of Bourgogne, Anjou, and Berry, was born on December 10, 1637 at Denonville, France, and he died thereat on September 22, 1710. He was the son of Pierre de Brissy, born in 1607, whom had inherited the title Seigneur de Denonville, Vicomte de Montbazilic, Seigneur de Bellevillers, Seigneur Châtelain de Théville, Seigneur Marquis d'Avesnes, Seigneur de Chesnay, and Louise d'Ales de Corbet, daughter of a Huguenot aide-de-camp and gentleman-in-waiting of Louis XIII. Both families ranked as members of the lower nobility, that is, they were not among the great families of France, hence they had to struggle to advance their fortunes, and they enjoyed fair success. In 1636, Pierre de Brissy and his wife abjured the Protestant faith and returned to the Church of Rome. Jacques-René de Brissy de Denonville was born a year after his parents' conversion, but the stern Calvinist background in which his parents had been raised left its mark. All his life, Jacques-René was very devout and a staunch supporter of the clergy. As the eldest surviving son, Jacques-René took the title Marquis de Denonville and entered the army at an early age. W.J. Ecclesiastes, Dictionary of Canadian Biography. 12 Pierre de Troyes, a French soldier, died at Niagara on May 8, 1688. 13 Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville etc. Artilleries, soldier, adventurer, baptized on July 20, 1661 at Ville-Marie, Montreal. He died on July 9, 1706 probably at Havana, Cuba, third and most famous of Charles Lemoyne's 12 sons. 14 Chevalier Louis Hector de Calliers was born at Thorigny-sur-Vire, province of Normandy, on November 12, 1648, and he died at Quebec on May 26, 1703. The family came originally from the province of Angoumois where, in 1490, the king's commissioners recognized the nobility of Jehan de Calliers. 2 years later, by his marriage to Parrot du Fort, Jehan de Calliers came into possession of the seigneury of Cleric in Saintonge, which subsequently became the family's principal place of residence. Jacques de Calliers, father of Louis Hector de Calliers, was born in Touraine at an unknown date. He was a follower of the powerful families of Matignon and Orleans-Longueville, whose protection enabled him to become brigadier general in the royal army and governor of the town of Cherbourg, Normandy, in 1644. In 1643 Jacques de Calliers married Madeleine Potier de Courcy, daughter of the Seigneur of Courcy, near Coutances. 2 daughters and 2 sons were born of their marriage. Jacques de Calliers died at Cherbourg in 1662. 15 His baptismal name was Louis Thomas de Joncaire and his seigneurial title was Sieur de Chabert. 16 Antoine Marie de Joncaire de Chabert was born about 1648 in earliest record at St-Rémy de Provence, Als, Bouches du Rhône, Province Alpes Côte d'Azur, France. 17 Gabrielle Hardy was born about 1642, in the earliest record, at St-Rémy de Provence, Als, Bouches du Rhône, Province Alpes Côte d'Azur, France. Antoine Marie de Joncaire de Chabert and Gabrielle Hardy were married before 1670 at St-Rémy de Provence, Als, Bouches du Rhône, Province Alpes Côte d'Azur, France. One child, a son, is known to have been born of this union. Louis Thomas de Joncaire de Chabert was born in 1670 at St-Rémy de Provence, Als, Bouches du Rhône, Province Alpes Côte d'Azur, France. 18 Vaudreuil, in 1706, issued an order forbidding Cadillac to let his men in the Detroit settlement take Indian wives because experience showed they became good-for-nothings and their children the same. Frontenac was said to have had half-breed descendants, of which were the prominent family of Montour. A report of 1709 says of Vaudreuil, he has had to order Joncaire to get rid of one Montour, who springs from such a marriage. It appears that all children born of it make all the trouble possible for the French. 19. The explorer Antoine Lamotte de la Mothe Cadillac was not of noble French birth as he claimed, but simply adopted the La Mothe Cadillac surname when he arrived in North America. Instead, he was born Antoine Lamotte on March 5, 1658 in the village of St. Nicolas de la Grave, Gascony in southern central France, although, some sources say department of Tarn and Garonne in place of Gascony, and hailed from relatively prosperous local families on each side of his parentage. His father was Jean Lamotte, lawyer and councillor of the king at the Parliament of Toulouse, whom married Jean de Péchagot, the daughter of middle-class landowners on March 16, 1646. It is thought that Cadillac was educated at the Doctrinal College at Moissac, or perhaps at an institution in Toulouse called L'Esquile. He also claimed to have been a cadet in the regiments of Dampierre-Lorraine and, later, a lieutenant in the regiment of Clermont-Balt, around 1677, but he may have earned a criminal record instead during this period of his life, and hence the name change. 20. Marie-Therese Guyon was born in 1671 at Quebec, and she died, age 69, in 1740 in France, 10 years after Cadillac. 21. Judith was born in 1689 at Port Royal, and she became an Ursuline nun at an annual cost to her father of 6,000 livres. Magdalene was born at a date and location unknown. She also became an Ursuline nun. Antoine was born on April 26, 1692 in Quebec. He traveled with Cadillac to found Detroit and, in 1707, was made an ensign. He is believed to have died in 1730. Jacques was born on March 16, 1695 in Quebec. He traveled to Detroit with his mother in the fall of 1701 or spring of 1702. Pierre Denis was born on 13 June 1699 in Quebec. He died in Quebec around the age of 12 months and was buried on July 4, 1700. Marianne was born on June 7, 1701 in Quebec, and was buried on June 9, 1701. Cadillac mentioned in a letter a child born in Detroit in 1702 or 1703, the child likely died in the fire of 1703, the baby Madame Lamotte was carrying when Cadillac left for Detroit marked her 7th pregnancy. Maria Therese was born on February 2, 1704 in Detroit. On February 16, 1729, she married noble François de Posax in Castel-Sarrazin, France. She died there in February of 1753. Jean-Antoine was born on January 19, 1707 in Detroit, and was buried on April 9, 1709 in Detroit. Marie-Agathe was born on December 28, 1707. François was born on March 27, 1709 in Detroit, and he lived until after Cadillac's death. René Louis was born on March 17, 1710 in Detroit, and was buried in Quebec in October of 1714, and Joseph, whose birth date and location are unknown. 22. Yves F. Zoltbany, Dictionary of Canadian Biography. 23. 1700 marked the final year of the conflict between the French and Iroquois that had begun near 20 years earlier. 24. Onontio was a title used by North American Indians of the Great Lakes region to refer to the governor of New France. The title was first given to Charles de Montmagny and was subsequently applied to all later French governors. Onontio is a Mohawk rendering of Great Mountain, the literal translation of Montmagny. Each Onontio was the head of the Franco-Indian alliance, and as such was expected to mediate quarrels, provide supplies, and, in general, maintain the alliance. The title was used by both Iroquoian and Algonquian natives who addressed Onontio as father. Onontio fell from power in 1763 with the conquest of New France by the British Empire in the 7 Years' War. The British conquerors seemed unwilling or unable to fulfill the role of Onontio, which was, as a father, that of a mediator and provider rather than a conqueror. As a result, the natives of the Great Lakes rose up against British rule in Pontiac's rebellion, attempting in part to restore Onontio to power. The native war effort was a failure militarily, but the British revised their policies and began to fulfill some of Onantio's duties. The new Anglo-Indian alliance proved beneficial to the British Empire in subsequent decades as the British were able to enlist native allies in struggles with the United States. 25 Pierre Alphonse de Tonty was born in 1659 to Laurent de Tonty and Angélique de Liette. He had an older brother, Henri, who was part of La Salle's expedition to the Mississippi, whom was renowned amongst the natives as the man with the iron hand due to an artificial hand. On February 17, 1689, Tonty married Marianne de Belestre, daughter of Picotte de Belestre, not sure which one. We know of two, one who born in 1677 and his son who was born after 1710. Sometime after 1689 and before 1701, Tonty married Marianne Lamarck, daughter of François Lamarck. This was Marianne's third marriage. On May 3, 1669, Marianne's first husband, J.B. Nolan, died. Her second husband was Antoine de Fresnel, Fruel, de Pipaudière. 26 Chevalier, a boastful and unscrupulous adventurer, also took part in expeditions against Orange, Albany, New York, and Corler, Schenectady. In 1707, he was one of the Canadians recruited by Charles Joseph Amiot de Vince-Lottie to go to Port Royal, Annapolis Royal, NS, and make up the crew of the frigate, La Biche. He then served under the privateer Captain Pierre Morpain. After a lucrative career privateering, he returned to France, where he is thought to have lived for a while at Brest, St. Malo, and Nantes, and to have died at Tours during a brawl on December 11, 1731. 27 Variously spelled Clayson, Clausen, Clausen, Clace, Clace, or Clace, John Elmer Reed, History of Erie County, Pennsylvania, Volume B.1, page 8 of 63. 28 Fort Orange, Dutch, Fort Oranje, was the first permanent Dutch settlement in New Netherland, on the site of the present-day city of Albany, New York. It was a replacement for Fort Nassau, which had been built on nearby Castle Island in the Hudson River, which served as a trading post until 1617 or 1618, when it was abandoned due to frequent flooding. Both forts were named in honor of the Dutch House of Orange-Nassau. Due to a dispute between the Director General of New Netherland and the Patroonship of Rensselaerswyck regarding jurisdiction over the fort and the surrounding community, the fort and community became an independent municipality, paving the way for the future city of Albany. After conquest by the English, Fort Orange, renamed Fort Albany, was soon abandoned in favor of a new fort, Fort Frederick, which was constructed in 1676. 29 Illage or Hillage, Dutch for Alice, Cornelies van Olinda, daughter of frontier trader Cornelis Antonissen van Slyke, married Ots Tok, daughter of Jacques Hurdle, a Frenchman and a Mohawk French princess, was born in the Mohawk Valley during the mid-17th century. Cornelius was about 42 at the time of her birth and her mother was about 23. She had several brothers and sisters. Her brother Jacques Cornelis van Slyke, owner of Van Slyke Island, today attached to the mainland, was 4 years older than her. Hillage was raised with her mother among the Mohawks, until 1663, when she left her and went to work as a servant for a Dutch woman who taught her to read, write, and speak Dutch. She also explained Christianity to Hillage, whom was later baptized. Her pagan mother had a very low opinion of Christians. By 1666, a popular figure among the Mohawks, she was hired as an interpreter by the Dutch authorities. For several years Hillage was employed with Jan-Baptiste van Epps and Laurens Claes van der Exalgen as provincial interpreter to the Indians. On June 11, 1667, in payment for her services, the Mohawk sachems gave her the great island in the Mohawk River at Ziskiyuna at Niskayuna, today called Shaker Island. In 1669, her husband sold the great island to Captain Johannes Kloot, yet the sachems gave Hillage and her sister Leah, wife of Klaas Willems van Coppernal, more valuable land above Schenectady, called the Willigen, Willow Flat, and at Watervliet. Hillage also inherited the boat of the Cahuts. Hillage's father, Cornelis Antonison van Slyke, was living near Cahos, Waterford, and several other points at an early date. In 1683, Domini Godfrey Delius, a new church leader, arrived in New York and, by 1685, had replaced the aging leader of the Albany Church. In the fall of 1689, he formed an alliance with Hillage, and between them they made their first convert in December, the first of hundreds of Mohawk converts to the Dutch Reformed Church. She had an in-depth understanding of not only both languages but the spiritual traditions of both sides, and was able to translate native concepts where others could barely translate the words. Prior to Hillage's involvement, there were virtually no converts to Christianity after 70 years of attempts by the Dutch. She died February 10, 1707. Her husband, Peter Daniels, made his will in August 1715. Their son Daniel married Lisbeth Cregier on June 11, 1696, and was living at Half Moon in 1720. 30 Eve F. Zoltbany, Dictionary of Canadian Biography. 31 John Cayer also had a wife among the Iroquois whom he had married in the 1690s. 32 Marie Magdalene Gay de Bully was born on August 6, 1686 at Montreal, Quebec, and she died on June 22, 1771 in Repentigny, Quebec, and is buried there at 33 Jean-Jerome Gay, Sieur de Bully, son of Pierre Guy and Paul Lebret, was born about July 1, 1660, and he died in Quebec. 34 Magdalene Just, daughter of Hubert Just and Madeleine Daumont, was born on July 1, 1662 at Brives, Nievre, Burgundy, France, and she died in Quebec. Jean-Jerome Gay, Sieur de Bully, and Magdalene Just were married on December 17, 1685 at L'Isle de Montréal, Commune Turban de Montréal, in Quebec. One child, a daughter, is known to have been born of this union. Marie Magdalene Guy de Bully was born at October 6, 1689 at L'Isle de Montréal, Commune Turban de Montréal, in Quebec. 35 The eldest child, Philippe Thomas Chabert de John Cayer, known by his father's title, Chabert, was born on January 9, 1706/07 at L'Isle de Montréal, Commune Turban de Montréal, at Quebec, and he died in 1766. He was presented by his father to the Senecas at the age of 10 to learn an education. He married Madeleine Renaud du Buisson on July 23, 1731, and, in 1751, became a captain in the colonial regular troops. Chabert died in Canada shortly after the conquest. The seventh child, Daniel Marie, Sieur de Chabert et Clossonnet, known as Clossonnet, was born on January 6, 1713/14 at Repentigny, L'Assomption County, Quebec, and he died on July 5, 1771 at Detroit, Wayne County, MI, and is buried there at. A lieutenant in the French army, he later succeeded to his father's position as interpreter. He was a prominent figure in the Niagara region during the 7 Years' War, but was later implicated in the Canada affair and spent some time in the Bastille following the conquest, and after his release returned to America to die at Detroit in 1771. He married a woman named Ursula who mothered him children, Louis, Philippe, David, Angelique, and others. Both of these sons followed in their father's footsteps. 36 Bourgmont went on to form a good relationship with some Native Americans on the Missouri River. In 1718, he wrote to the court in France asking for 2,000 livres to buy gifts for the natives. The request was denied. However, on August 12, 1720, Bourgmont was commissioned to lead an expedition to make peace with the natives of New Mexico and to establish a post on the Missouri River. He founded Fort Orleans, but it was abandoned 2 years later. 37 Louisiana, this huge territory, what is now the southeastern United States, held little interest for Cadillac. He dallied for over 2 years in the oppressive tropical climate amongst Spanish settlements and hostile natives before arriving near what is now Mobile, Alabama, in June of 1713. 38 Jacques-Charles Sabrevois, Sieur de Bleury, son of Henri Sabrevois and Gabrielle Matron, was born in 1667. He was a lieutenant in the French army during the war with the Iroquois, 1695–96. Sabrevois married Jean Bouchard on November 16, 1695, and they had 6 children. In 1718, Sabrevois was made Chevalier of the Military Order of St. Louis. He served as commandant at Fort Chambly from 1721 to 1724 and as Major of Montreal until his death on June 19, 1727. 39 In 1722, Cadillac was awarded a pension, rights to some Detroit holdings, monetary restitution, and the Cross of St. Louis for 3 decades of service to the Crown in Nouvelle France. That same year he sold his Detroit real estate and, in August of 1722, purchased a commission from the Crown that gave him the governorship of the nearby town of Castel-Sarracen, in Gascony, near the town of his birth. The appointment was made official on December 11, 1722. He was inducted as mayor of the town as well, but was removed from the post by the king not long afterward. Cadillac died in Castel-Sarracen, Gascony on October 16, 1730, and was buried in the cemetery of a Carmelite church. Although he and Marie-Therese had 14 children, only 3 survived their father. 40 An Algonquin word for stockings. 41 Memoir on the Indians of Canada, as far as the river Mississippi, with remarks on their manners and trade, 1718. 42 Magazine Royal served as a trading post until the opening of the secure post in the House of Peace, Castle, at Fort Niagara in 1727. Local tradition fixes the site of Magazine Royal on the present Bridge Street at Lewiston, a few rods east of the tracks of the International Railway Company, and within a stone's throw of the bank of the Niagara. 43 The builder of the trading post at the head of Lake Ontario, the builder of the trading post on the Bay of Kent, and the officer who spent the winter of 1720–21 on the Niagara, are apparently the same man, variously designated in the printed documents as Sieur d'Anville, Sieur d'Agneau, and Sieur d'Auville. The name is also to be found written d'Auville and d'Agneau. Some of these variants are doubtless due to illegible manuscript, or inaccurate copying. He appears to have been the same officer who, at a conference with the Iroquois at Quebec, on November 2, 1748, signed his name d'Agneau Duville. He was a lieutenant in the detachment of Marine troops serving in Canada. In 1750 he is spoken of as Sieur Duville, Commandant of Sault St. Louis, and in 1756, when he shared in another conference with Indians at Montreal, as Lieutenant Duville. 44 Yves F. Zoltbany, Dictionary of Canadian Biography. 45 Jean-Baptiste de Strs, Sieur de Chalon, son of Pierre, Seigneur de Saint-Ours and Marie Molloy, was baptized on October 11, 1670 at Sarle, Montérégie, Quebec, and he died on June 9, 1747 in Quebec. Jean-Baptiste de Strs married Marguerite Lagourdour, daughter of Pierre Garde de Repentigny and Agathe de Saint-Pierre, on November 25, 1705 at Montreal, Isle de Montreal, in the presence of Lieutenant Joseph de Cabanac. Strs was a career military man who saw many battles, and seemed to prefer front lines action to settlement administration. He fought against the British in July of 1708 and, in 1709, against the Fox warriors who attacked Detroit and Mackinac. In 1719, Strs was made commandant of Michilimackinac but left that position after about 1 year. 46 Louis Henry Deschamps, Sieur de Boisvert, son of Jean-Baptiste Deschamps and Catherine Gertrude Macquard, was born on February 8, 1679 in Quebec, and died on June 6, 1736 at Montreal. Deschamps was only 2 years old when his mother died. In 1701, his father married Jean Marguerite Chevalier. 2 years later, Deschamps' father died. Deschamps entered the army as soon as he was old enough. In 1699, he fought in the war against the Iroquois and helped guard the harbors of Newfoundland during Queen Anne's War. He helped capture 3 English munitions vessels in New England. In 1709, he went to Quebec to seek aid for the Acadians but injured his foot en route, putting a halt to his illustrious career in active duty. Deschamps married Geneviève de Ramezay, daughter of Claude de Ramezay, later governor of Montreal, on December 10, 1721. 47 Yves Jacques Hugues Pien, Sieur de Livandière, son of Jean-Pierre Pien and Anne de Courbarboineau, was born in 1682 at Paris, France, and he died on January 26, 1747. He married Marie-Françoise Picoty, daughter of Antoine and Jean de Saint-Ars Picoty, on June 15, 1722. Livandière was commissioned commandant of Fort Frontenac in 1724 and, later, he was commandant of Fort Chambly. In 1733, he was made commandant of Fort Pontchartrain. Some writers have confused Yves Pien with his son, Michael Jean Hugues Pien, whom was involved in a conspiracy, or conspiracies, that eventually led to the French giving up Canada to the British. 48 The Navarres are descendants of Antoine Navarre, Duc de Vendôme, who was a half-brother of Henry IV, King of France and Navarre. Robert Navarre was born in Detroit in 1739, and he died on December 21, 1791. His father, Robert Navarre, was originally from Villeroy, France, but came to Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit in 1739, from Nova Scotia. His mother was Mary Lutman, Boreas. In Detroit, Navarre married Louise de Marsac, granddaughter of Cadillac's sergeant, Jacob de Marsac. In 1734, Navarre became the royal notary at Fort Pontchartrain. He maintained similar positions for most of his life, through British and part of American rule. 49 Philippe Thomas Joubert de Joncaire, son of Louis Thomas Joubert de Joncaire and Marie Magdeleine Légué de Bully, was baptized on January 9, 1707. At the age of 10, was sent to live amongst the Seneca, probably at Ga Saga, near Geneva, New York, where his father's trading post is said to have been located. From then until the fall of New France he spent most of his time in the West. He joined the colonial regular troops, age 19, in 1726, becoming a second ensign in 1727. He, age 24, married Madeleine Renaud du Buisson on July 23, 1731, and rose to the rank of captain by 1751, but he was a diplomat more than a soldier. 50 Nicolas Joseph de Noailles, des Noyelles, son of Colonel Joseph de Noailles de Crécy, was born in France in 1694, and the date of his death is unknown. In Nouvelle France, Noailles held the position of captain in the Marine Department and also served as commandant at the Miamis, near present-day Toledo. In 1739, Noailles joined an explorer named Vérandry in an expedition west in search of a water route to the Pacific Ocean. 51 Pierre-Jacques Payen de Noyen, Sieur de Charves, son of Pierre Payen, Sieur de Noyen, and Catherine Jean Lemoyne, was born on November 3, 1695 in Montreal. Charves married Catherine de Levaut on November 17, 1731, they had 4 children, one of whom, Pierre Louis, was born in Fort Pontchartrain. Charves had been a captain and then major of a company in the Marine Department before serving as commandant of Fort Pontchartrain from 1739 to 1742. He was unpopular, though, because he tried to stop the sale of brandy to natives. In 1749, Charves became major and governor of Montreal. 52 Pierre-Joseph Céloron, Sieur de Blainville, was the son of Jean-Baptiste Céloron and Hélène Picotte de Bellestret. He married Marie-Madeleine Blondeau on December 30, 1724. The couple had 2 children before Marie's early death. After Marie's death, Céloron married Catherine Uri de la Perelle. Together they had 9 children. In 1734, he was commandant of Fort Michilimackinac. On July 6, 1742, he became the 9th official commandant of Fort Pontchartrain. In June of 1744, when his term as at Fort Pontchartrain ended, Céloron was sent to Niagara. In 1749, he led a party down the Ohio River to claim the area for France. In 1750, he was appointed to a second term as commandant of Fort Pontchartrain and held that post until 1754. He died in Montreal on April 12, 1759, the mayor of Montreal at the time. Céloron Island in the Detroit River is named for Céloron. 53 Paul Joseph Le Moyne, Chevalier de Longueville, son of Charles Le Moyne, Baron de Longueville, was born on September 19, 1701 in Longueville, and he died on May 12, 1778 at Tours. Le Moyne married Marie Genevieve de Joybert on October 19, 1728 in Quebec. They had 11 children. 54 The notorious Ottawa chief Pontiac was likely born around 1720, although some say he was born as early as 1703 or as late as 1725, in an Ottawa village that was in the Detroit area, located in or near what is now Defiance. Some sources say he was the son of an Ojibwe woman and an Ottawa man. Some say his mother was Ottawa and his father was Ojibwe. Others say he was of another tribe, possibly Catawba, and was taken prisoner and later adopted by the Ottawa tribe. Various sources refer to Pontiac as Algonquin or Miami. Whatever his origins, he remains history's the most infamous Ottawa. 55 George Croghan was born around 1718 in Ireland and emigrated from Dublin to the province of Pennsylvania in 1741. His father died young and his mother married Thomas Ward, who also emigrated, along with Croghan's half-brother Edward. Relatives remaining in Dublin included cousin Thomas Smallman's mother, probable brother Nicholas Croghan, a Dublin merchant, and grandfather Edmund Croghan, whose landed property George Croghan claimed by inheritance. Croghan is an Irish place name pronounced in America as Cron or Crone, based on common misspellings of his name in a variety of ways. 56 Little is known of his early life. A Flathead, Catawba, by birth. Tanacrisson had been captured young and adopted by the Senecas. He died on October 4, 1754 at Harris's Ferry, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Philippe Thomas Joubert de Joncaire reported that Tanacrisson was from Lac des Deux Montagnes, Lake of the Two Mountains, part of the river delta widening of the Ottawa River in Quebec, where it feeds into the St. Lawrence River, and that he was formerly inclined to the French, but at present he is more than English. His importance lies in the role he played in events leading to the outbreak of Anglo-French hostility in 1754. The Catawba, once one of the most powerful southeastern Siouan tribes, and other Siouan peoples coalesced as tribes in the southeast, but were decimated by earlier smallpox epidemics, tribal warfare, and social disruption. The Catawba declined markedly in number in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Primarily involved in agriculture, the Catawba were friendly towards early European colonists but were at almost constant war with tribes of other major language families, the Iroquois, the Algonquian Shawnee and Delaware, and the Iroquoian Cherokee, who fought for control over the large Ohio Valley, including what is now in present-day West Virginia. They served during the American Revolutionary War with the colonists against the British. 57 It was there on the banks of the Niagara River that the explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, built his ship Le Griffin in 1679. 58 Jacques-Pierre Dayneau, son of Nicolas Dayneau, Sieur de Mouy, one-time governor of Louisiana, was born in 1695. Dayneau married Louise Genevieve d'Autoul on January 30, 1725 at Montreal. They had 6 children. 59 François-Marie Picot de Bellestre, son of François-Marie Picot de Bellestre, was born in 1719 at Montreal. Bellestre married Marie-Anne Nibard, and they had 6 children. Bellestre married Marie-Anne Magnan on January 29, 1753. 60 Gahit Dodon, the half-king's son, attended treaty negotiations at Carlisle in January 1756. 2 daughters, one of them the Indian wife of a trader John Owen, remained for a time at Awick where Fort Shirley had been built, but left in July 1756 with a soldier from the garrison. A daughter-in-law, identified as Nancy, was living on the upper Susquehanna River in this same year. 61 Robert Rogers, son of James Rogers, an early settler of Dunbarton from Ireland, was born in 1727 at Dunbarton, New Hampshire. He was married to Elizabeth Brown in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. 62 James Delancey was born on October 24, 1663 in France. A Protestant, he fled to Holland because of the persecution of the Huguenots in France following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by Louis XIV. He moved to New York in 1686, became an important man, sitting on the Assembly of the colony for 24 years. At his death, his fortune amounted to £100,000, about $18 million today. On the death of his father, Captain Delancey left the army to take care of family business but became very involved in politics, wanting to win the election of '69 in support of the Sons of Freedom, which voted en bloc for Delancey.